Good. Okay. The advantage of death caps modified healthcare makes the ACA unsustainable. The drive for profit increases costs and healthcare. Widescreen 16, the ACA strengthened for profit insurance. Obamacare is financially unsustainable. The federal become double. 27 remaining underinsured coverage is becoming usable. The profit insurance produces expensive attempts higher than the public. These pay for marketing and exorbitant salaries and dividends. The insurance corporation profit denying or delaying care. Neoliberal health reform emerged from horror military policy and theft and assessment sector defense emergent architect managed combination the model for clean reform Obamacare. Obamacare and neoliberal health reform Obamacare and his supports and profit insurance. Obama was who favored single pay change position. Obama received the largest financial contribution from the insurance industry. Obamacare emerged as one of the one company worldwide agenda developed by financial institutions to promote market-driven finance. Act commodification care executes thousands every year. Must transform healthcare into a social institution to address mass inequality, confront neoliberalism, moving to commodification, neglect of healthcare as a social institution. That means that they explicit ban of neoliberalism from Cuba, Venezuela, Colorado, found rest for healthy youth, and known as wealthy and other system ideology to exist, create a healthy environment. Health inequality success much greater toll like arbitrary execution, which like in the health inequality state of government that exceeds in proportion to population share without cost of solution need to be recognized viable and the red neoliberalism kills health must be political neoliberalism root cause and so alternative must be found the marketplace for its surrounding healthcare, the growth of fetish system forced out of the value sets, the job community values returning systems to people association to allow health maximization. Neoliberal approaches to health lock in inequality, poverty, ecological mediated structural violence, only democratizing health from the bottom up is key to preventing extinction. McCoy 17 poverty increasing worldwide down to distribution while the power is created based on democratic section to be captured by elites. A critical sector recognizes futility health gains and threats posed to climate change ecosystem cost and by corporate resistance growing levels of violence 8% extension threat to humanity do not see unsustainable consumption ecological media structural violence destroy the prospect of future generation hundreds of millions of poor people health theories rooted just sustainable across any second political dimension liberal theories redistributing power and wealth of permanent justice and foundation of new economic models of autos whose systemic change but change only could turn by dimension from the ground to create pressing change from the bottom up. Thus the United States federal government should establish a comprehensive national health program utilizing progressive financing. Only single payer can overcome the death gap in health outcomes. Standstill 17 inequality kills insurance and the amount of life that helps us uninsured and limited scope because the payment systems contain the ability to buy new covenant of some parts of healthcare system structure raising costs of black and brown property instead of certain zip codes. Hospitals face fear resource shortages are multi-where for profits spread the system prevents premature death. Even patients with insurance face skyrocketing co-pays, taxes, and pharmaceutical pricing keep seeking care 27% postponed avoided care because of the cost 23% skip your recommended treatment and 21% just not to fill prescription for 20% seen left so it's in the family Canada with single paid life the gap between rich and poor day current lights for profit insurance for families pay increasing burdensome prices for profit insurance geared to maximize returns to high quality low cost care Medicaid varies by state the system equitable low income patient best solution national average working independence would pay new tax with no complex payments to navigate no prohibitive co-pays and no corporate workflow and technically care for the employee would eliminate $250 billion annual tax ups in Medicare for all public access for poor and rural such with all hospitals and clinics surviving the many threat would extinction would eliminate inequities. No one would be left out. Empirics from the VA system improve universal health care successfully reduce the death gap in 16 increasing universal might play and role of settings to show the equal associated lack of insurance mortality remove without a critical self coverage excluded and same critical class sharing disproportionately harms minorities even device versus universal might nonetheless be powerful to reducing racial health inequalities. Evidence comes from quasi single payer system. The VA may even eliminate some racial inequalities. The system does not impose taxes barriers that disproportionately impede blacks risk of heart disease blood deaths lower among blacks defining build on existing leadership multiple studies point to reduction in racial inequalities. No doubt there are still discriminatory practices such need to be addressed by a more egalitarian structure in healthcare system may go further in combating ubiquitous racial inequity. Structural racism within medicine is malleable. Change requires active political engagement. Bailey 17. Structural racism being better to behavior is real analysis. Structural racism required recognizing the problems to change to do with the public health governance by participants navigating and then have been advocating to ensure that medical and public health tools incorporating essential pedagogy by race and health into the standard coursework approach to this instructional competency culture committee and culture safety encouraging lifelong commitment self-reflection and mutual exchange. Several local health departments have already incorporated anti-racism training self-professional development and introduce internal reforms to drive organizational change. Anti-racism should be judged on contribution to organizational effectiveness. Remove race and institutions is essential to protect and promote the well health of diverse community. Structural racism has a substantial role shaped the distribution social determinants health vision of health equity. The commitment to tackle and structural racism and health inequalities will resist commodification care forces vulnerable populations to make choices against their self-interest such as participating in clinical trials. Only universal insurance all systems having neoliberalism must be examined level citizens not to cover the last substance obligation on one's healthcare medical neoliberalism combines body changing the structure of payment as profound effects managed care by saying vaccine standards practice medicine to become less resource good more aesthetic bodies offering clinical trials subsistence and other options to consumers and other medical neoliberalism and clinical research become responsible choice for individuals who do not have access to required medical intervention. Neoliberal policies cure inequalities to those who participate tend to be subject to systematic abuse uninsured economic disenfranchised and subjects not seen as sexual but is seen as an opportunity by expanding ethics to include sexual factors child participation regulatory approach to protecting subject to be protected challenges status quo clinical trials cannot be ethical until social inequalities recognized and mitigated through expansion universal healthcare may be our best defense creating an ethical system research both economics and race and former apt dichotomizing approach to result in failed solutions. Gaffney 16 economic and health inequality York Sanders goes or argument presenting economic predictions and statistics we call upon for codes and screw cost online here is a great deal of overlap given potential economic inequality race and beauty welfare by necessity anti-race dark theory of economy and class and race-based messages reflective neither history nor reality trying to mention the pure fact of race and illusory content the effects of place and race are intimately interwoven in policy diminishing inequalities along lines means healthy universal and powerful step towards racial health justice economic one about race tightly corresponding health and death must be addressed. The apt places neoliberal approaches to health with the social solution proven by successful examples across Latin America. 15 Latin American social medicine trends and capitals organizing changing structure and sensory transforming well social medicine connects healthcare to politics, social change, and activism, gender transforming on equal conditions, absent product condition, research, consolidation, and leading to individuals model of success and health exists in dialogue, relation, marketing, political participation, intervention, social media, sport, towards transforming the underlying relation production, dominant fabric, health, and good governance, Western innovation, Chile, Cuba, Mexico, Bolivia, Venezuela, operating sites, volatile organisms, reducing the entire structure, Cuba, the factors, system committed to addressing structure, determined healthy barrier, gender movement, and Venezuela connecting community solutions, state infrastructure, alternative global narratives, grounded in concrete politics of popular participation, social health perspective enables broader coalition to achieve equality. These movements can change international approaches to health, aloft in 16. Despite divergence in all references to social justice and global health, the policy class, gender, race, ethnicity, migrant outcomes are contextually specific. None of support to recognize that capital is continually restructured to externalize costs and almost expanding the cost of health risk. It is constant health care area of investment, pushing out costs of health to because that's because the social costs of health and communities play a good role in the health system. Social accountability to be greater for each prioritizing Western social network, not corporate profitability, expansive changes communities, Cuba system inspired radical institutional addressing social costs requires fighting the political basis coalition, find common ground with groups working against gender, racial discrimination, migrant rights, land rights, better working conditions, collective power built to struggles waged by coalition pushing national health policy to affect the agenda, multilateral institutions such as the WHO. Fundamental policy change necessary to reduce health inequality, only addressing proximate costs can make root cause analysis effective. Scott Samuel and 15 health economic steps to negative impacts to cost of investment materials, social factor poverty, poor housing, and social exclusion, inequalities will be reduced as a result of fundamental policy change, inequalities are productive inequalities, viruses, and long-term production are penal strikes indicated from root cause reduces inequalities, provide justification, policy action, difference in health emphasis, cost science, what is changing the immediate proximal costs to people, important circumstances until premature targeted policies have no impact in capital society, we're looking back with no policy position, all income active benefits, and example incentives to blame the victim rather tackle corporate economic costs, when he said alternative framing of each open health inequalities to move beyond analysis of how things are to consider how things could be. The demand for single payers and non-reformers reform that build solidarity paves way for future challenges. State power, Dan Brown is 17, and fighting for people solidarity and power for the working class. Everybody in South Carolina, nearly everybody funded by private insurance, self-interest, the sex, we only win single payer for ourselves, to win it for each other. The parties are urging anti-racist stroke, the uninsured rate 6% higher for black people, the black lives platform demands universal system to Latinos, uninsured rate 300% higher, undocumented immigrants, not colored, despite the fact immigrants pay taxes, universal programs, deficit, social care, science, 07 game to push further towards building a powerful multiracial working class movement, institutions for inclusive for immigrants, essential single pays are critical feminist fight, care costs more for women, it's hard to say no, policy interviews, constitution, single pay, women, power for the working class, no other form of power towards future struggle, women, reforms, and strength of a condition be advanced for more radical victims, single pay, strengthen health and bargaining position, and other benefits to non-reforms, for elevates the ability to people to fight while radically shift the window of political possibility, universal programs, attention to limiting wealth inequality, creating strong working class less, easily exported, they build powerful new constituencies, dedicated to defending public goods, universal programs, function, and solidarity, making insurance, university, guarantee, assert that coverage right and build a stronger body policy, mobilize, protect that right. Debating political solutions is an iterative process that uses the academics inside of movement building that creates a bulwark against Trump's fascism, Taylor 17, oppression, shapes the left's movement, and creative uncertainty, Trump policy to make the left side sustainable, administration attack immigrants, and invitation for people to continue to assault black communities, Trump is right about sexually, so the witness, declared war, Muslim, be seen over violent white supremacy, right, what is uncertainty, extent which Trump to be able to follow through uncertainty, based on calculation ability to build movements toward the red agenda, the organized possibility exists, only recognize the academy side of politics, struggle to see in the flower campus structure, and now we see them in political space, and the right wing certainly does, fellowship below not politics, there's a need to connect the legacy, wisdom, struggle, transformation, a new generation of students desperately looking for the future, not already written, we have already seen the eruption, mass struggle, now occupying BLM, Trump will demand more than moral race, requires strategy, must create the political and intellectual space for debate, policy, ideas, matters, just much action, not suggest we should be disagreement about the good about deficits, just we should be clear on what is the base on which we can unite, discover through debate, struggles like the the atmosphere to be, not only does political establishment want to punish the voice of black liberation, but they want to bear the legacy, history, and politics of the movement, the black struggle, circumstance, how the margins can upend and detail by supporting the black freedom movement to become a platform for other liberation, struggle, the challenge continues to lies in our ability to transcend new argument and debate and struggle the path that crisscross and potentially divide resistance, the call for solidarity, on the basis of bearing over different experience, solidarity, recognition of basic technique, entry to one is ancient all, in other words, truly possible if we struggle for it. The Trump's policies create the opening for a single payer of track will intensify suffering for millions that lose insurance, 10 and 17, the ACA even healthcare crisis, environment, public basic free marketplace and bank survival, prohibited cost, the ACA includes millions, including immigrants and poor price wants to defund public health programs, the eventually between two healthcare crisis, the ACA free market, the other, and insurance club single payer looks like the last democratic universal solution, Trump and crisis, giving an opportunity to Trump of Obamacare is functionally for Republican privatizations, banks for mass movement, single payer providing equal access, facing the costs on sustainable systems, appetite for adjusting fundamentals. If the left fails to advocate for single payer, the right will co-opt the working classes, men, fascists, and green in 17. We cannot simply back to Trump advancing the program, people always huge swap of the public is best, but we're can't right flank to the platform, waiting to be used for genuine debate and action, the demand for Medicare for all offers needs to build solidarity, civil rights, access to universal healthcare as a critical component of struggle for just and equitable society, and demand a unified forward organization to become making over to the poor rights. We can't allow pitch for healthcare to be used as a gateway to fascism, protesting against white supremacy must be tied to political programs, talking about the ways in which class warfare from gender, racial discrimination, turns to virtually everything by challenging narratives and linking to concrete demands. We can reach out to people who we galvanize but might not know what can be done as in this year for improving political conditions in the near future, which has to be done before more change, change strong left expands public zero, offering a broader conception what's politically attainable, the most potent answer to the far right, and effective left push Charlottesville will have to consider itself in long-term planning and organizing. Political ontology is the basis for critique, gives way to socially weightless solutions that ignore deep value lived experience, making 17 ontology, platforms such witness and threatening for close to social power, parent and insufficient attention to patriarchal so live depression, objection of inequality taken to bodies and live there, seemingly need the natural dispositions. Natural dispositions. Yeah, give me one sec. Okay.
You good?
Yeah.
What are the specific elements that create death gaps?
So the important one we think is lack of insurance. People go to the doctor, they have to, prohibitive copays and deductibles means that they delay seeking preventative care when necessary, so they get more chronic conditions, etc.
Okay, how about this? Better yet, what social determinants determine Black health?
There are a whole bunch of them. That's the point of the data evidence.
Can we go through some?
Yeah, so inadequate access to housing, food, water, etc. Those are in the
And
data
what does the
evidence.
1EC do to resolve those?
The McCoy evidence says that a demand for universal health care and redefining health as something that's not just biological but socially determined generates movements against neoliberalism
We'll
that
take you up on the
cause
We'll talk about
pressure
the McCoy
for the
evidence.
state.
It says, quote, growing levels of violence present an existential threat to humanity. What constitutes humanity and what forms of violence are threats to it?
What constitutes humanity is kind of a big question. I'm not sure the exact definition of humanity.
We have 2 minutes and 6 seconds left, so let's try and work it out.
Yeah, a bunch of people a lot smarter than me have tried to come to a definition of humanity.
But so you're not going to define that for me?
Yeah, a lot of people would die if neoliberalism continues unabated.
Very shoddy answer.
Yeah.
The Bailey evidence says, quote, without a vision of health equity and the commitment to tackle structural racism, health inequalities will persist. What do you envision health equality to look like?
People getting free access to healthcare.
So as soon as Black people get the AF, their health is on a level playing field with white people?
No.
Why not?
Because there are disparities in access,
So
but we reduce the
why is that
a big
a world
one.
with health equity?
Hmm?
Why is that a world with health equity?
We're not saying it's perfect health equity, but we think Black people should have access to health insurance.
That's the goal.
The Mooney evidence. What does transforming healthcare into a social institution look like?
That was the stuff explained via the data evidence. A good example is the Barrio Dendro movement in Venezuela.
Well, the reason why I'm asking is the card says, quote, health must be political. I'm just confused as what it means to politicize health.
So one, demands on the state for universal health insurance, we think is a pretty big example of politicizing health.
Well, it's political because
it's
it
one.
encompasses all aspects of your life, right? Health is a factor of your housing, of your economic status, of your race, etc.
So that's the social health stuff we were talking about earlier.
Day evidence indicates a universal right to health is key. Why should white people have a right to health?
We think everyone should have a right to health.
All lives matter. What has Trump changed?
What has Trump changed? He can cement fascism if he really wants to, because he's terrible.
What makes Trump's version of fascism different than what we've seen prior in America?
So one example is he's building or trying to build a wall to exclude a whole bunch of people, which would be a pretty bad version of contingent violence that we think is a little bit different.
Ooh, what makes, okay, now keep going.
He's also rolling back a lot of things. So people gained healthcare access under the ACA and repeal the ACA, getting rid of the mandate.
By the way, he just appointed John Bolton as national security advisor.
Perfect.
He wants to start a war.
Sounds good.
It's at 1 case.
Hold on this.
Yeah.
Should I speak from here?
You could speak from the table. Right
It's like
into the
really
camera.
close from the mic.
Yeah, that's fair. How far does the camera capture?
It can see y'all right now from where you're at.
Okay, so if you speak from here, it's like not gonna.
Yeah, honestly, y'all speak from wherever you want, and I can move as
Okay.
needed.
Okay, I know when y'all have it up. Everyone's good?
Black suffering is the centerpiece of American liberal democracy and is the base point upon which political imaginations are thus elaborated and articulated. The 1EC is made possible by an enlightenment, rational subject which precludes the slave and the place in American civic polity. Their political cause are sutured by an anti-black collective unconscious that is heightened by the privilege by the 1EC's called to NHI Malaklu. In 18, the suffering of non-black persons and color endured the people's possibility of the constitutional exclusion of African-born and descended people of the Euro colonization philosophies of right liberalism, and also non-black suffering was a return to the priority of the state who also tried to betray the integrity of liberal democracy. But here we are. But not like marginalized people were protected by the constitutional contract of the state, but also guaranteed by the human community. Also, place our trust in liberal governmentality, the anti-black heart, mind, also. Percent of the retribution law determined by the boundaries of the new America's new political liberal economy is also the type of typifies the slavery's afterlife in liberal America with a metaphysical exclusion of all racial blackness of liberal claims from the human universality because precluding the seven membership of use policy that comes from the American facilitation or do impossible with use also use metaphysical violence and also inherits you Western European political order from the man but also equality the rights but aside the responsibility of the reason also the men being in time and also they never understand themselves as what he is not black African but African America is exceptional only when we sanitize the rehabilitate the promise of liberal America the closing our eyes to reinterpreted suffering of black persons that are ineligible for his rights to endure but also catastrophic are assault on liberties that activates the Part of requires bad faith for the vehicle of actualization of our freedom, but also hysterical reactions for the trauma also commensurate all the vulnerabilities irrelevant to the shamelessly how we ask ourselves vulnerable and reorganizing efforts to gross violations of black lives carry out our names. The best we have so civil society is selectively provisionally incorporated into the rules and also replicate towards humanism market. Humanism, the one easy focus on access, obscures anti-black foundations of care, structural barriers prevent equal access, and even when access occurs, anti-black medical encounters ensure that black people never receive quality care. Instead, medical complications are exacerbated. Higgins in 17. The conversation concerning health disparities in the role of the institution of healthcare also focuses on issues of access to health coverage and themselves does not guarantee access to care, but access although limited of access to continue to reside in racially segregated neighborhoods. Also, those neighborhoods also continue to experience shortages in terms of healthcare providers and their boundaries, but also blacks are subject to different treatment of the racialized process of medical decision making. Also, the rational contribute to the racial health disparities by white sufficient. Also, the settled time of the black patients and planning treatment also provide health education, best and patient knowledge of answering questions of their white patients. These types of stereotypes distinguish black people able to understand detailed but technical medical advice to be partners with their own treatment, but also physician time of the medical knowledge of Russians is white more than their other treatment. Blacks are less likely to be received or recommended for more advanced and expensive ones comparable to white patients, but also document less advanced and desirable technologies of procedures that also disproportionately for black people, but also blacks are increased risk of complications that otherwise been ameliorated or prevented. And slavery is a political system of anti-black desire that mutates and perfects itself according to contingent changes in the political economy, from plantations to segregation to prisons to the world of the plant. Contingent changes veil an unchanging hierarchy of human over black that maintains anti-black captivity, vote, negative presumption, Farley, and 5. Slavery is with every animated by slavery with every situation of the distribution of goods and also covenant with every moment. Slavery, segregation, unused segregation movement, slavery perfecting itself, the slave perfects itself the will of the battle before it's master of free will, but also the slave accomplishes the impossible reconciliation of freedom by unfreedom, and also the slave notice of the never first master culminates the field of the law, hoping for an answer, but the bourgeois legality is also wherein the equals are said to be enter the comments of reason, but it discuss universal lives, the principle also equal equality and freedom of the way because slavery is to see everything must go, but also request for equality and freedom, whether fail with the request is granted by denied the request is produced through injury, but the education cultivates our desire and a direction of hierarchy that also acquire an orientation towards enables us to locate ourselves bodies vis-a-vis all of the bodies that inhabit our institutional spaces. So white over black is orientation and pleasure that desires to inhabit our own space, and therefore technically our own spaces. The degree of equality provides distinguish from the hierarchy that is slave, also commodifies the own experience for right that is a fidelity to the law that's perfected through the struggle that is also the same struggle of equality for right, and we must work for the logic of survivability in every instance. Anything less continues a violent inherent social valuation that locates politics on the terrain of the thinkable. The full embrace of death is necessary for the unthinkable politics. Cacho and 12. Because we cannot think of the devaluation of thinking bears challenge to remember the other by remembering the value of the politics also projects the social values inconceivable, imagining politics based on the refusal of social values impossible to an unthinkable option, but there's also a social death that makes it at the point that dare not go because of it requested to take think beyond or what is possible to take unthinkable seriously. We must think counterintuitive thoughts, but also conceive of ethical states that requires us to cover the nonsense in the present, but the theoretical test is not integrating the socially dead, but also society that also makes it perfect system mobilizing against the life of way, knowing that also serves as breathing into life in ways of social death, breathing life in space. Social death is also like organized against the logic of survivability. The world is subsumed by the slave relation, not relations of capital. We must use the language of accumulation and fungibility, not exploitation and alienation. We'll understand in 8. The world is unethical due to the subsumption of slave relation. The slave is also relegated to the capital relation, but it has to be solved. But that's also where the world would be so subsumed by slave relation, antagonism of the ropes and the constituent element of slavery, but also an incidental experience of the slave. The slave is also over-determined by human relationality, but the slave would have been no foundation for human exchange. The aspect of slavery that is so on 30 the control of symbolic considerations of the slave, not also dishonor in a generalized way, but also exploitation of the alienation is not an essential rubric for suffering. That also of being a captive, but the rubric must be replaced by the accumulation of fungibility, because there can be no calibration between the black and the human, without the destruction of all the relationality possible. The real movement cannot be anything else less than but we have nothing absolute, nothing non-entity, but also the black pride becomes a tangible goal, but also the level of understanding being discovered with respect to the paradigmatic analysis of the black positionality. Thus, the alternative is a transvaluation of pathology. 6 instead. Optimism that works away from the discourse of black pathology towards the right as the issue of taking into the holding of the account the states of black pathologists as relation to black people. Does not occur here is a consideration of possibilities of something with the unfolding of the project of projections of activism and knowing full well the danger of a negative reification as associated with the analytical claims of paradigmatic, but also might be the case that the logic class and phenomenology that also I think appreciating the whole the encounter that older habits into through the reinscription of black pathology also resents the cause because it only relocates the source that never gained really inside of it, but there is yet a vote of Gordon the full of value, full insight into phenomenon. He fully accepts the definition where the concept pathological in terms of the even imposed by the world itself, the imposition of remaining things that are reactive sense that insist on the heterogeneity within itself and the image of cultivating a culture, but also accepted the affirmation is active of the willingness, but also what pay whatever social costs is inhibiting black social life and the social death market. Social death voting negative is to adopt nihilism as a centerpiece of politics. Is intervention in liberalism's will to action finds itself outside of the struggle for political representation. It's not an abdication of hope, but rather a reconfiguration. This is the only metaphysically coherent response to the constant slaughter of black bodies. War in 15. The conceptual instruments of political normality, black suffering, and black violence would also reproduce the conditions of litter existing unbearable for blacks. Black theologians of black optimists also the immediacy of black suffering in a place of the social order that can do little but much. The black keeps struggling to survive, but also hope becomes a vicious and abusive cycle of metaphysical problems that a struggle would be terrifying that depends on the black decision to sustain itself. The black nihilism is also implicated in big distress would also be important because knowledge is a cemented reducible point of the epistemic flavor of certainty, but also diminution to live life. While the point exists for life, but it limits the enables the sustains the knowledge, but also right up the episteme of life, but also grammar, which requires the position outside of this point because black nihilism hermeneutics is the point. The point is also political point. Political hope is pointless because black suffering is the essential part of the world and the place to help in the very structure that sustains metaphysical violence. The political will never solve anything in black nihilism. It attempts to wrench hope from the clutches of the political. Can we think about us hope as the political, the transmission solution of the political government must be a political program. Do you want me to just go to case? Sure. Okay, market program. Case. Health insurance commitment. Health insurance is a promise of access fosters a commitment to the informatic optimization as a means to achieve it. This falls in line with the genetic science in a way that it results in biological predestining populations towards an endless information accumulation on the path to health. In 14, the will to health is shaped in the way that the balance is conceived because from the illness towards optimization, there's identification of social determinants that also health literacy is responsible for risk averse population optimization, reflects biological destiny, and also the confidence in the risk of illness of being diminished with the main health inevitably minimize the judgments from regarding the ideal embodiment, the goals and value practice with the body must be in accord with the ontological distinction with the sustainable healthcare, but also the distinction of the natural, artificial, biological, biology, technology, and outside of the beginning to be the health. It also has the far-reaching implication that human life is posited, and their non-reformist reforms are consonant with the strength of the settler edifice that arises from a civic imagination of the U.S. as the post-colonial, post-imperial states. Not brought in 15, the framing of the U.S. civic polity is almost entirely the colonial structure of the past, and also around the civic imagination. The country's been birthed in the anti-imperial, the very essence of American exceptionalism, the stratus of first colonial society is opposed to the continuation of European colonialism because white Americans think of themselves as the civic rather than settler civic identities also developed under the ideological uncertainty of closing the frontier, but also raised the questions about the future colonial settlement with white Americans also began to rally around the specific reading of the Constitution as a moment to which university accessible enlightenment deals with the first historic, but also presenting the countries that exclusively exceptionalist turns. It's also separated the view of the European imperialism and the American global influence that also been later depicted benign to literature in terms of the way that the interests of non-white people are civic arguments are providing the ideological framework privileged by the Americans to preserve the basic institutional structures of the polity, but also increasingly so the settler project, also starting the greater authority of polity because the shift of the civic nation to the Americans has never been converted by the colonials infrastructure living legacy of the settler history marked and legacy and that guarantees a global logic of dispossession through things like biopiracy. Commercially in 15, there's biopiracy also poses a threat to the indigenous lives of indigenous people, taking account of the corporate focus on the approach to agriculture and resources, shifts to the control of food system and natural environment to the indigenous communities. And in terms of corporations, colonization of indigenous knowledge through biopiracy exhibits the complex powers of nexus that also reproduce the subjects in order to allow for exploitation to occur the relation between people and places to be maintained in order to for the whole world whole world weighting of the capacity to combat a large scale damaging effects of globalization.
Okay, so I want to talk about the effects of NHI as a result of the metaphysical violence against black people. Why are rates of clinical trials higher on uninsured black people than insured black people?
Sure. So your question was why are rates higher? Argument is that whole analysis and metric relies on a faulty assumption of value that we're already impact turning.
So we shouldn't value reducing
gains and
trials.
losses through empirical data points rather than understanding the indeterminable excessive suffering.
Is the grammar by which you articulate what is necessary and what is valuable that we have called into question?
Gotcha. Can we combine analysis of those empirical?
No, because
so
one is
okay, we completely eschew empirical data. So then, how does Wilderson?
The ontological register prefigures what
I understand that. So how does Wilderson come to this conclusion that this ontological state is based in a liberal economy?
Well, I'm not sure necessarily if we've made those specific arguments in the 1 and C, but those are analyzed through a position of looking at the effects of violence and looking at the
effects of violence. How then does Wilderson do that?
The way that Wilderson does that is by writing in the context of black revolutionaries who have undertaken different forms of struggles and is looking at what those experiences.
So is it like interviews with these black revolutionaries?
It's a lot of in-depth analysis.
A lot of in-depth analysis.
Pages, books, articles that delve into history, the same way any other scholar
so
would be able to.
I want to talk a little bit about the details of rejecting the logic of survivability. What does that mean for a black family who wants chronic cancer treatment?
That's already asking the wrong question because again, it's asking things at the level of the empirical rather than understanding the way that all of the ontology arguments prefigure values.
Okay, so
those things are calculated on a basis that's incoherent.
I understand. So if you were to give a response to this family who's looking for treatment, would you say,
that's like asking,
I can't answer that question?
Should we give families in Auschwitz a better like daycare center?
Really?
Yes.
Okay.
That's the tuner.
No, but our argument is that the way that you are portraying the violence that happens to black people is fundamentally incoherent in the way that we've described it.
So I understand. So post the AF, let's say there's free care for all, etc. How then does metaphysical violence against blacks intensify?
Through the obfuscation or the narrative of.
So
we're going to
I understand that there.
vitality that obscure those, but also the obfuscation of how power works is one that allows it to be even more.
So I guess,
pernicious in
can
the
you
way that
describe
it's
what form of metaphysical violence the AF causes, and not just like obfuscates?
like everything tied to the paradigm of America that subjects people to a set of values that is rooted
Which
within
values?
the expulsion of humanity. So there are certain values about freedom, rationality, reason that are all things that are defined over and
Gotcha.
against.
Have those
the
ever
absence
been
of
used in a positive way?
Have those been used in again, if you're able to point to examples of those things being utilized in a certain manner,
Mhm.
our argument is that's an obfuscation of the way that ontology determines the way that these values can
So how do you ever? Okay.
through the alternative, a transvaluation of pathology.
Here, I'm sending it out. Or actually, 1 second. Okay, I'm good. That was 7 seconds.
There you go.
Yeah, I like that. Much better. I was getting kind of sleepy because of it.
The username is WSU Debate. The password is 2018 NDT @ WSU. NDT is capitalized.
Is anybody not ready?
Dear paradigm can account for commodification, healthcare, which emerged from Cold War, military policy, displays social care, market competitions, institutions, prioritize profits over people, that's weights increasing, that outweighs one. Death gap, black insurance results in 1,000 parental deaths each year among poor, black, Latino, poor populations, Mooney and Ansel twos, neoliberalism, and global structural violence that threatens biodiversity by massive resource exploitation, puts plans to survival, racism, McCoy evidence there, Duff evidence doesn't apply, info optimization says, quote, it's about the modern conception of medicine towards optimizing health. That's not our app, which uses social health, which critiques the biomedical view. Even though we say social determinants, we modify that with the death gap to indicate the unique racialized factors of this, and the social health stuff acts as the correct. But they say non-reformers form bad. This Rana card's a link of omission. You can recognize America's colonial past and implement single payer. Second is that social health solves. America's social past is a factor that informs health today. Our day evidence takes it into account and can propel broader movement buildings. This is offense for us because we check Trump and American imperialism abroad. Academic spaces are key sites for political organizing to develop strategies to challenge Trump. The app is part of the successful transition of activism to propel social change. The Taylor single payer is a non-reformer support in the build solidarity and paves the way for future movements that create fissures in civil society. This day evidence, they drop the global spillover argument. Coalitions link up internationally, affect the agenda setting, multilateral organizations. That's the Wallen evidence. This process of movement building outweighs and turns their alternative. The far right's already encroaching on academic spaces. Only the app can create a counter public to challenge Trump's fascism. That's the green evidence. Or bioprivacy. Our stuff has zero link to the app. It's just an FYI. We solve it because we clamp down on corporations, which means it's offense for us and prove social contingencies. Okay.
We get to weigh the entire app. 1, fairness, unpredictable, regressive framework structure skews the debate. Fairness outweighs its prerequisite to clash. 2 is solidarity politics, using academic spaces to chart political futures creates a bulwark against Trump's fascism. That's Taylor, Day, Green. 3, policy nuance, understanding the nitty-gritty of health financing is necessary to overcome the failure of progressive politics. 4, problem orientation goods, ontological questions are tautological, and bracket, lived experience, which naturalizes oppression. That's the midday evidence. Perm, do both. Their black suffering link, it doesn't link. Focusing on Trump doesn't mean we ignore metaphysical violence. The app is centered on the racialized death gap, but resuscitating human thought is key to human survival. Kamala and 17 planetary inequality on the climate change, racism, and all right fashion movement central to issue to human survival. Pose the challenges to academic political practice, engage in the role of crafting theoretical challenge the theories and analysis human will be inadequate to provide the meaningful guidance and transformation in this moment. Demand the human solidarity struggles are immediately practical writings of where the abstract musing horizon arguments cannot contain futures with possibility ideas and constant argument development anti-liminal struggles intervene in the present sincere and single commitment to the human politics of radical critical modernity rather than limited plotting of the black identity. Thinkers that understand the projects as wholesale rebuilding modern humanity inseparable from utopian political commitment, political imagination, and Emory, politics agents of planetary salvation with a long history. Radical likeness exists within the conscious desire for life, full engaging creation, and refusal of retreat from humanity to maintain the possibility of reparation, justice, the struggle reigns, how to fully belong in the world of past from legacy, the creation of the world in common. The attention time allows the past to become more contingent and future, more open than 3 demand that we examine the relationship between the politics, economics, and epistemology. Decoding approach cannot be found within academic discourse of living knowledge, traditions, planning, and attending the seeds for the unexpected, unknown, and even impossible to share the affirmation for the freedom, solidarity, interconnectedness, understand the freedom of emancipation as a project that remains radically inclusive, spatially expansive, and temporally heterodox. Afro-pessimism is a dangerous moralism, which conflates the anti-black project with its achievement that ignores successful movements that transform the world through political commitment. Recorded 17, anti-black world not identical to the world as anti-black, such as an project, not an achievement. Black people have fought and continue to fight CBLM, the same applies to social death, such would render even these reflections still stillborn the basic premise their life and perform competition black among each other and live in a world itself and other colonials pretend to present man can struggle and dialect the absence of agency powers, ethic, liberation, politics, and responsibility of pessimism face the hidden premises of why agency versus black and passive proponents don't respond as if the theory's agency avoid the fallacy of confusing sources of outcome. History's not full short of bad ideas from good people. The goal of pessimism of achievement would be attitudinal symptom of anti-black society pessimism. The other side the same optimism, both nihilism. No, people no longer want to be responsible for actions that would be prior to events actually unfolding. The future is yet to come. But enslaved ancestors were committed to action without guarantees of the revolt. The micro macro acts of resistance, the safety returns that the course for the struggle today. The activism suffered from failure to understand failure what it's done. So initially we're transforming the condition for something new. The alternative relational human constant negotiation, ongoing effort to build a relationship. No one enters a situation without a shift in grammar mechanics cannot be known before their actions. The radical failures transform the relationship facility. Other kind of acclamation, revolution, turns rebellion, sharps into make each other little and carousel activism with thoughts into faith that infinite resignation without the committed action. We simply nihilistic. There's for the failure of failing. Focus on resignation of the goal. The act would have already been paradoxically be successful. Failing flaws, social not turning away from the social world. Throw statement is not political resignation, seeking purity, collapse into moralism instead of public responsibility by action. Human world brings many forms of being into being those afford relationship, build institution, moralizing thoughts of the sense of addressing the institution, make the immoral individuals irrelevant, demands political solution powers of the world. They responsible to establish relations beyond the body, properly discourse appeals to incommunicability, even the slivers that were rejected from our competition, tempting the communicate the singularity, absence of requires for consistency, silence. The question remains becomes why I don't see the answer, but without the cynicism, marketability, of pessimism, immediate paradox of satisfaction, dissatisfaction, as the paradox of 9 times the best option is to move on. It's not libidinal or Hudaism 15 that racism not is integral to the psyche, social content has psychic impact, any effort to comprehend by reference to a collective unconscious doomed to failure for, but not declines that collective illusions are psychic, they are not permanent features, they are habits acquired from the social and cultural imposition, not granted any archetype for finance. The relationship between socioeconomic, psychological, racism not be solved at the psychological level. It's not an individual problem, it's the social, but they saying it's libidinal, pathology, oppression, which is Pat Fraser, and 13 identities are not simply suited from psyches, they are drawn from fun interpret possibilities, most of the history with specific practice through which descriptions are produced, not the case identities, fixed, they alter over time with shifts and practices, cultural authority, negotiating, consummation, where political practice would without empowering struggles without the cultural freedom from political engagement, the structural model presupposes becoming a theory. This contrasts object by abstract using social practice in the context, practice question practice agency and the subject cannot illuminate the process by which identity, security, context, and lenses of the model that the essential contradiction among the social media by reducing discourse as symbolic system, the model of acquisition, agency, competent practice, one result of determinism, historically continued dominance, now here's the invariable subordination described as inevitable intent of the autonomous, so psychological imperatives dictate that cultural homogeneity, reification of diverse practices on monolithic symbolic order, described quoting the tranpositive divinity, the conceptual quantized contingent practice, the raising possibility of claim risk collapsing into tautology. The other could be no question how the authority of dominant groups established contest there's really a single universe of discourse, so monolithically one cannot conceive alternate practices the way is logical political practice. Their insurance critique, insurance is care and solves medical racism. 1, we link turn the racial biopolitics argument, lack of insurance forces poor populations to make choices against self-interest to receive for money or to receive care that's fisher. 2, universal access, cost is the largest barrier. The app allows black folks to choose their doctor, which puts all the racist ones out of business. That's Ansel. 3, empirics, the VA system equalized health outcomes. Multiple European and Latin American countries prove the efficacy of single payer. That's Gaffney and Duda. 4, social health, that perspective recognizes well-being as tied to structural determinants such as race, which improve the doctor-patient relationship and creates new models of care not rooted in bias. That's the Duda evidence. 5, movements, public health protests such as Diane's force medical schools to incorporate anti-racism training into coursework. Only a vision of health equity can address bias. That's Bailey evidence. 6, the all fails that only points out a problem without proposing a solution. That's the Scott Samuels evidence. We're not just focused on access but social health. That was all done in the overview. The survivability stuff. You should reject this wipeout argument. It's ethically disastrous to let people die from neoliberal violence when you have the opportunity to prevent specific manifestations of violence. That proves the link term in NDT card, which says that they bracket off important ethical questions. I'm going to finish that here. Experience is always needed through the power that requires careful analysis between embodied morality and material and symbolic relations, political ontology and bodies. Self-inclusion, rising and intellectual unification, producing exclusion, ways of viewing the world, the form of self-reflection, its curtailed suspension to such that society enslaved from the external standpoint. way that delivers epistemic contributions to theoretical views, arguments for combat internal necessary logical ontology rather than social concepts. Ontological theories, ungrounded theories remain enclosed in self-perpetuating paradigms of how research approach continues to be of importance where interest inequalities are deepening. It's important not to give up on the moment. It seeks to answer the question about identity, constitutive dynamics, political behavior, scrutiny, social things, and to dislodge appearances natural and reveal the contingency critique as problem rather than paradigm driven social theoretical rather than ontological abstraction. As engaged social critique chips away the problems and produce an account that has a practical unmasking domination, contributing to gradual actualization of other ways being. Their fungibility links radical humanism is an impact turn to this. It proves the capacity for social agency exists. Labor is a relevant frame. Taylor in 11, the millions are without the health insurance. The question of union must be a concrete discussion how to collectively go forward. No serious market organization demands the black workers put their struggles on the back burner. That rests on the ridiculous notion that the working class is white, the working class is female, immigrant, black and white, the immigrant, gender, anti-racism are working class issues. So this is anachronistic. Fungibility oversimplifies the world and ignores that ways that class, gender, immigration status, or even influence health. Only addressing race and classes, interwoven processes can shackle the full spectrum of oppression. That's the apathy and wasting evidence. The social perspective can understand fungibility in the context of health and use that to inform single pair, which proves the permutation solves it. Nihilism is wrong and political hope isn't useless. Rogers in 17. The complexity of political tradition, lived experience are flattened. The sleight of hand conflicts of hope and certainty. We do not believe the progress enough of that to think that through our efforts we may move towards a society, to a more just society. No good will come out of the refusal to engage us from to rush out over the tradition of struggles for justice in which hope and faith are forged through the political darkness. Hope involves commitment to the possibility of realizing the goods of the faith. Use the vision to resource and remake the present. The faith is never exhaustive. We are not finished. The faith makes politics, but maybe threat than certainty. Progress neither automatic nor inevitable. Codes and verse exceptional from replacing with equally fatalistic idea that use is fundamentally broken. This weakens our resolve like activists that use the darkest hour to make our way out of no way. The Walker, Douglas Wells, and the BLM are reminded the disposability. Our keepers of the faith. This would be impossible for people who accept Code's perspective. Faith is not deny the present, but refuse to be defined by it and sink into the faith is fully realistic and rejects illusions about the sure progress hopeful without being optimistic or political convenience not fated to be believing. Otherwise, what makes white supremacy more than practices that makes human nature courses not dismantle white supremacy provides it with support. We must not claim to know what we cannot possibly know. Their use of slavery as a metaphor in their barley cars bad ignores how the racial nomos has changed, which naturalizes white supremacy is also proven by the awkward moment cross acts about the Holocaust. It's obviously not true. Gilroy, 1815. There are many connections between contemporary order and slavery. However, not since slaves important not to let metaphor blur the difference between our condition and the slave. The racial nomos has changed to abstract and refined magnitude like whiteness are helpful. We have to see its economic and social conditions of existence. How does it become articulate to medical expertise? There are concrete problems that open whiteness and multi-layered struggle, manichaeism, the colonizer, creates manichaeism, the colonize a bad place to get stuck.
You might want to read this like empirical.
Empirical causal theories are better than alternatives. Well, and 5, good theories should be logically consistent and empirically valid because the logical explanation that are consistent with available evidence is more likely to provide an aggregate to cause connection with that shape the events. A good theory is complete, does not leave us wondering about the causal relations at work. The theory is unsatisfying when identifies important causal factor, but not the factors most responsible for determining the outcomes. To say that oxygen causes war is true, but that such information does not help us understand when a war is more or less likely completely. It also implies the theory has no debilitating gaps. Mark the gaps. Yeah.
Let me know when you Good? Alright, so how does the app tailor healthcare towards social determinants? Like, what is the process by which social... Because there's a point in the 2AC where you're talking about how, oh, the app is a really good idea because we take into account the ways that disparate social phenomena we can tailor those more effectively vis-a-vis like the healthcare system. So I'm asking, how does that process come to be?
The point of social health is that the movements for health encompass movements for things like housing, movements for economic justice, minimum wage,
Honestly, how does that inform like
That's what
healthcare?
I'm saying. Is like the movements for health are not limited to just insurance, but to broader movements, right? Healthcare,
I guess that's not really what I'm asking. I'm asking what is the relationship between those movements and then like the types of care that people receive.
Oh, like the physical care administered by the doctor?
Or just the health insurance program.
We're
Like,
saying
what is the relationship between the social and the way the health insurance program goes down?
This is a little bit of a vague question. I need you to contextualize it for me.
So you made an argument that the app is a good idea because it takes into account the way that black people are disparately affected socially, and then the health insurance program that you have instantiated is like more tailored towards those things, i.e. the social determinant of the health insurance. I'm asking just how that comes to be.
Our argument is that health, well, I mean, I think what you're trying to get at is like, is there a difference between like social, like, I don't understand your question to be completely honest.
Fine.
But
so
like,
you made an argument about
I just don't
linkages
understand the
and
question.
like solidarity politics. How does the app like facilitate or make those linkages?
Facilitate or make linkages for solidarity politics? Because health insurance intersects across a lot of different areas.
Yeah, but like what movements or like what linkages?
So like BLM has advocated for universal health insurance. They've advocated for single payer.
You made an argument about global linkages. That's
the O'Loughlin evidence says that social health movements link up internationally. It's given. And
so what does that mean?
What does it mean to link up internationally?
Like?
They then pressure the domestic contingency within their country and affect the agenda setting of the World Health Organization.
So what country gets healthcare because the U.S. did?
It's not that other countries necessarily get healthcare, but we lead to global movements in the United States.
What is the end point of any of this shit? Like, that's what I'm asking. It's like,
well, there are a lot of impacts to the app. The first impact is the death gap,
Okay.
because single care immediately
so
results that. Second is neoliberalism, would lead to broader
your
change
Bailey
in the
evidence
world.
uses the term structural racism, and then the 2AC you read a bunch of evidence about anti-blackness. Can you parse the difference between those two terms if you think there is one?
Well, anti-blackness was a term coined by Lewis Gordon. I'm
What
not
does it
really.
mean?
What does it mean?
Yeah. What is it that the app does?
That addresses racism?
So what is the relationship between structural racism and anti-blackness?
Well, they're obviously interconnected with each other.
I'm
What's the
asking
point
you
you're trying to get at?
I'm asking you a question, so it's not really.
I'm not a dictionary. What's the point you're trying to get
Okay.
at?
The last question I have is about this like labor frame card that you read. What about the labor frame explains the gratuity of anti-black violence?
The labor frame?
Mm-hmm.
We impact turned the idea that it's necessarily gratuitous. Our argument is the labor frame is useful for social organizing.
2 minutes, stop right.
Do you want me to run against it this time?
Yeah, good point.
I think it definitely needs to.
Consent, orders of the day. With an overview. Anyone already?
They think this debate is about social determinants, but our argument is the largest social determinant of black ill health is sociality itself, which is configured by ontology decay. It's a prerequisite to addressing anything impact claims because our argument is the way that they derive values calculated over and against blackness the human. It's a rational being with free will and freedom constructed by the Enlightenment. Freedom begs the question of unfreedom, which points towards how the question of human autonomy at its constitutive level is owning oneself work. It's not the constitutive element of slavery. Ownership is the world is divided between those who own and those who are owned. Thus, democratic participation equal to having property ownership for governance. The human cultivates relationality and capacity from this autonomy. For example, the 3/5 clause wasn't that black people are 3/5 of a human, but rather 3/5 of representational capacity for those who own slaves. The construction of humanity requires it to be curated in opposition to slaveness, which has become bound up by the middle passage with black and civic engagement in the sociality they engage writ large is based on the sacrificial lamb American democracy, which is the slave, the nothingness of blackness against which the human capacity is created, turns space into place and time into an event which establishes value for the human that's incoherent for the slave. What this means is that they are starting from a point that doesn't call into question the foundation. Any meaning-making practice that requires blackness to be the 0 point of abjection analysis cannot be approached with the rubric of gains or reversals and struggles with the state and civil society, not unless and until the interlocutor first explains how the slave is of this world were, in fact, turning your entire field of knowledge, they understand violence at the level of the sociological register, not the ontological. That register outweighs and comes first because it destabilizes the metrics that we use to determine suffering and improvement. The impact is a form of vertigo spawned by your body being rendered fungible to give coherence to an entire system and supposedly democratic exchange that facilitates your daily set genocidal dispossession based on knowing to exist with value and be a subject worthy of recognition. You must not be black. The ontology debate means that they have to prove the way they cultivate values epistemologically sound, not just say balance is contingent, so we should solve it, because that whole notion of solving contingencies already assumes it's about gains and losses rather than relationality and value. The case of prerequisite to any of their impact claims because the way they justify those impacts is based on a value system that cannot and must not think black suffering. Thus, the alternative is a move towards black pathology, which refuse to engage in the process of healthy social integration in favor of affirming the totality black abjection is a condition for thinking through the modern world. Once you accept the alternate streams valuation pathology, you realize the biggest threat to health isn't the absence of white coats, but rather the presence of white bodies at the base of corporeal integrity. The alternative is politically enabling, not disabling, because it works towards ending the world, which means all of their link turns are all offense because they go towards the destruction of the collective social unity or human vitality. The framework arguments leave some space on your floor. That'll be the one and another permutation debate. The permutation either links or severs. We made arguments about why the hope imbued in their politics solidifies a racial hierarchy of human over black. That's the partly evidence means anywhere the permutation links means it gives structural integrity to a sinister type like Oedipus and strengthens its ability to operate in the psyche of students. Any form of severance permutation, the 1AR will try and spin it as makes it 1AC a moving target, which is a voter for advocacy skills we never learned. If anything, unconditionally severance firms our voter for education because they implicate how the policymakers that they create make unviable political solutions to complex problems. Second is the permutation is a prime example of plasticity. It's a structural adjustment in the terms of humanity and civil society that tends to include blackness, which evades the central question, which is that it's not about including or excluding blackness within the polity, but rather about how blackness is positioned by murderous conception, whether it's included or not. You can still be included onto the hospital bed, but excluded from humanity, and how the nurses look at you as criminal. A couple links that make the permutation impossible. First is the strongest sinew of the set of slave state is health, and that health is understood as social integration into humanity, which misses the mark that the slave relation is separate from the human relation. With their Moody evidence says health is political, they've given us the link. Subpoint A is their Jay and Brown evidence says, quote, universal programs can function as engines of solidarity to make insurance universally guaranteed, assert that coverage is a right, and build a stronger body politic that can mobilize, protect the right. The move towards health and vitality is one that assumes black people who don't have cancer or diabetes are healthy living subjects. It's an attempt to give with one hand a fraction what it steals with the other in the form of daily shootings, lacerations, and dishonorments that constitute black living. And it faces how civil society in its very construction is founded to make sure there is no social, political, or physical well-being relationality for the slave. It also asserts a right which is negated at the level of our ontology claim. Second is its investment in humanism. They can't imagine health is possible without humanism and civil society. The 1AC data evidence says, quote, the straight driven referendum is supported by participation in popular politics and widespread community participation in developing community-based resources and decision-making capacities. That community participation and decision-making capacity are prefigured by humanism because the political participation and voice requires a relationality that is not afforded to the slave. The 1AC assumes that the way to secure health is through political participation, which forces bodies to petition admission into a category that fortifies itself by casting those same bodies into conditions of destitution. The ontology undergirds ownership, which is the base point of political representation, which means voting affirmative requires pretending that the slave relation doesn't structure the modern world. Third is that they have missed the mark on social determinants. Thanking America for covering your medical bill after you've been shot by a police officer completely misses the mark on balance and faces the notion that the paradigm of America itself is a singular determinant of black ill health and its move to constantly pathologize blackness, which turns the permutation. They say humanism is key to human survival. That's Cumula 17. First of all, is that It is aspirational and empty of warrants. It says what we should strive towards human, but forgets to analyze how these different forms of paradigms are constituted in the first place. Argument is that the constitutive conditions of humanism are things like freedom and unfreedom, which has to are things like freedom, which has to pose a notion of unfreedom, which means that in the construction of humanism, they had to bind the opposite of humanism, slaveness, to something, which ended up being blackness. The Kamola card doesn't indicate anything at the level of theory that would negate this. They say Wilderson says they read the quote from Wilderson about world making. This quote is saying that anti-blackness makes the world in anti-black fashion. It doesn't flow affirmatively. The Gordon evidence, the Gordon card, he's just saying that there's no real human, and the formation of human is a contingent one. This doesn't negate ontology because Wilderson agrees that human is a contingent formulation, but that formulation is still used as a starting point to cast slaveness outside of humanity. We don't see to the perspective of races. That perspective is one that shapes the modern world. No part of this card is offense against our theory. Gordon's reading of moving past pessimism and optimism offers nothing new that after pessimism doesn't already possess, and they have no clue what Gordon is really arguing. This Wilderson innate how we understand suffering as a direct impact, how we imagine freedom, how we form a revolution. The bullets that were promised did not manifest within our psyches lethal deterrence because they were manifested rigorous recognition on bequeathed to blackness acknowledgement that we did in fact form a non-stop human capacity. The threat of reflective death, threat in response to the gesture of our collective, our living made of feel as though we were alive, as though we possessed in fact what we cannot possess, a human life as opposed to black life. We could die because we live building on Lewis Gordon's ontological scheme of absence and presence. The world cannot accommodate a black in relation at the level of bodies. Black presence in form of absence. For to see black is the black and ontological freeze that waits at gaze rather than living ontology moving with agency in the field of vision. The black's moment of recognition by the others already blackness. As Gordon points out, there is something absent when blacks are present. Human values and effective perspectivity to be valued is to receive value outside of blackness. Blacks thus cannot embody value. They make the crudest evidence about liberal economy socially made. The card just says that it's social, but doesn't explain how to resolve that or how you can change these different social manifestations. The affirmative doesn't change the collective unconscious of America that was structured by the middle class, which means they have no articulation as to how they're able to alter the liberal economy. That doesn't make them succumb to the link arguments. They say the impact of this is pathologizing oppression, but will impact turn this and say that that is something good. The alternative is of transvaluation of pathology by being able to occupy that position of the social cost of blackness. Only then can we be able to figure a whole set of infinite possibilities and relationalities that emerge out of that void of nothingness. They give a list of social determinants, but this misrecognizes the constitutive element of those social determinants, which is America, which only the alternative foregrounds a way to be able to get rid of. None of the affirmative does anything to resolve that. None of these afforded things change blackness at the level of humanity, which is the reason why none of these things matter under our value framing. They say moralism is bad. This links to you too. It's not an impact. It's not impacted out in a way that turns the reason why our project is something that is worth undertaking. You can group the fungibility debate. Labor is not the constitutive condition of slavery. According to Patterson, its ownership and destitution of slaves were lacerated in a way that exceeds rational utility, and that they were lacerated to a point that could even come at the expense of their ability to labor, which means that it's not figured by labor, but rather figured by the ability to be able to displace your own libidinal desires through a violent way onto these bodies that are rendered fungible, which they have not attacked at the level of theory, which means that you should default to the Wilderson evidence. They say that nihilism rejects change, but the alternative is politically enabling, not disabling, because from that void of nothingness we can affirm an infinite set of possibilities. For example, the Gordon card that the Wilderson card that I just read defends the way that from that void an infinite set of possibilities emerge, such as guerrilla tactics to be able to forefront different forms of violence, to be able to take down different institutions of power. They say slavery as a metaphor is bad. They should independently lose for saying that. We're not saying that people are bound in chains, but rather humanism binds slaveness to blackness in the way that it constitutes itself, and definitionally also laughing at the Auschwitz example also shows that their worldview is tainted by whiteness because it assumes America itself doesn't cause the same forms of violence that constitute the way people live their daily lives. It's an accurate way to be able to make an analogy between the two things. They say empirics is good, but this is also why all of their impact claims should be thrown out the window. It never gets to the intimate forms of violence that anti-blackness that outweigh, because if we solely focus on empirics, we never are able to analyze the forms of violence that manifest in the different ways that people have to interact with different forms of violence. Additionally, they should lose for making the claim that Trump's presidency has changed the status quo. The molecular evidence indicates it's not Trump's presidency that's particularly pernicious, but the rather liberal governmentality as a whole. Trump's fascist rhetoric is one that's still grounded in the American dream rhetoric and works to cloak its attachment to liberal governmentality, which is what Malakalu argues steers the ship of anti-blackness. The notion that Trump has done something antithetical to the edifice of liberal America, or that his presidency amplifies violence, is to miss the mark on unethicality. It's not Trump, but rather the entire system of valuation that Malakalu argues is premised off of liberal notions of rights that must be constantly defined in opposition to slaveness, which also answers all the humanity claims that they made. The fact that they think Trump has changed anything proves that they have misdiagnosed the world in value writ large, which means you can vote negative on presumption because they haven't reconfigured value in a way that makes any of their changes meaningful, whereas our intervention in value has the potential to prefigure meaning through the destruction of the modern world values through that the transvaluation of values, which means that only the alternative gets to the position of accessing a way to be able to change the way that violence operates, whereas the affirmative has missed the mark because they're operating in the wrong register.
Alright, you talked a lot about the importance of transfiguring value, and then you enable movements which end the world. How do you actualize this? Walk me through how these movements end the world.
Well, so all of these movements are attacks on the way that the world constitutes itself. It could be anything from guerrilla tactics that literally
Which
go out there
guerrilla
and bring
tactics
down
do you think are
police.
used? Which groups?
Again,
Which
it's
tactics?
saying specific ones is already a limitation on those infinite sets of potentialities. Argument is that because blackness occupies.
How do you know when these tactics have achieved? Alright, if there is not a grammar to communicate black suffering, then how do you know you've achieved a new grammar, right? How do you know when you've achieved these new values?
We haven't said that we've done that. We've said that a transvaluation of values is one that works towards the destruction of that, but to quantify when that happens, again, misses the mark in terms of does.
Right. How can you say racism bad without using a humanist grammar? How can you say racism bad without using a humanist grammar, right? Because like all the justifications are fairness, equality. Is there a way you can say racism bad without using humanist grammar?
Yeah, it's anti-black.
Anti-black.
Correct. It is violent to the.
Yeah, and the reason that is bad is
because it casts the slave outside of humanity.
Why is casting something outside of humanity bad?
Because it justifies doing things like brutalizing people, enslaving people, and working.
And those are all bad for like humanist reasons because people are intrinsically human beings.
Well, obviously it's bad for humanist reasons because slaveness has been cast outside of humanism, which is why we.
Well, no, because all those things that all those things that might be done, is blackness relational? Does it have the capacity for relationality? Can people understand black suffering?
No.
It doesn't have the capacity for relationality. Then why do those examples matter, right? Those examples you gave shouldn't even pop up on your register if it does not have the capacity for relationality.
Well, there are lots of examples of violence that don't even pop up on the register because of that, but there are certain examples of violence that we can foreground that we've said are indicative of the way that.
But why does that? If judges have a libidinal investment in ignoring all that shit, why doesn't it even pop up on the register? Why would they even care? How could they vote neg?
Well, from us being able to prove that your value system is cohered by something like humanism, that exposes the way that these things function. That's the whole point.
Circular.
The fact that
You
it's
reasserted
so
the
hard
claim
to
in order to prove your
because
argument.
you're so wedded to the logics of humanism. Only the alternative to transvaluation pathology allows us to even conceive of.
I want to talk about this example you give. You say that people will get health care, and that's not good because it's just like you get shot by the police and then you get your health care. That justification.
Of the argument.
Okay, but is there a fundamental difference between people who are choosing between paying for medicine and putting food on their tables for their families? Like, healthcare does make a difference at the margins, and you say no healthcare to them.
Empirical or sociological.
Does giving healthcare to someone matter?
Does not matter in the instance that we have analyzed the way that you have done stuff that is bad.
It does not matter within your ethical framework, but in the actual life that people live,
it does matter. 100% does matter, and that is this debate, and that's why you'll either win or lose this debate is whether or not you think that matters. You understand?
Yeah. It's case. Well, it's actually framework and then case.
You send out some cards.
Yeah. I thought it's the first time. Just let me know when you have a. Okay. Framework counter-interpretation should be a critical intellectual task with evaluating the best educational strategy or model of debate ensures that the affirmative can uphold a descriptive model that does not offend anti-black institutions that prevent whitewashed education to create an intellectually productive discussion and debate. They don't get the plan, but they get the politics that could lead to the plan. That solves their clash arguments because they should be able to defend why their relationship to politics is a good thing and have that debate. You can't just say shit and not defend it because any attempt to do otherwise link terms or fairness arguments. The most unfair form of debate is one where the 1EC can pick and choose what aspects of their politics they're willing to defend. This also solves a lot of their solidarity stuff as well, because it's a question of how their politics actually facilitates linkages, not an imagined version of the affirmative, but will be impact turning the way in which the plan goes down, in terms of informing linkages later on the case based. But what policy nuances do they get into? There's nothing that they do that facilitates those kind of nuanced discussions of nitty-gritty. They fiat away everything that is remotely relevant to how health insurance comes to be, like passage, lobbying, etc. There's a few dissents in their interpretation that are net benefits to ours. First, this pornotroping, they trade the suffering of black people in the intellectual marketplace of debate for a ballot, which tokenizes black suffering as a heuristic for the ballot. We have links to why their performance of the 1AC was bad. It was in his space was anti-black, which is also a dissent to their use of fiat that promises for egalitarian care, which inculcates a sense of hope, is in black people is psychologically damaging a kind of mode of politics that dooms them. Permutation Sullivan in 17. Collective methods of coping are far more effective than individual ones. Their greatest hope of a sense of individual efficacy is also a person lives out to see out communities and also networks of other black people that are upcharges that black hope and not serve as anything effective coping strategies. Also, black people is decreased likelihood that will be seeking out coping strategies that are effective. We also see what some scientifically studies and also lauded the health benefits for hope that also said necessarily utilizing these discussions also intend to help African American women cope with these effects of racism and also help to contribute to decline in black people's psychological physiological health. And Beast's point is distancing their hypothetical enactment is not benevolent. It's a way for them to divorce themselves from anti-black knowledge production and performance within this space. Their inability to reconcile the issues of quality care and increased access guarantees that more depot purveyors are inevitable, where Planned Parenthood was authorized to prescribe carcinogenic black box medications as contraception in order to sterilize and dispose of black women. This is especially important in the kind of politics that they export via global linkages, because it is one that necessarily invisibilizes the question of quality care for black women across the globe. If we win a 1% risk that the politics of the 1AC anti-black, then there's a 100% risk that becomes global, even if you give them that solvency which massively outweighs any of their impacts. Case. Their civic conception of equity is an ultimate form of bio-nullius, where the world stands readily available for data extraction. Their data evidence mentions movements in Cuba and Chile. All of these movements become pawns available for data extraction, which is what I was trying to get at in cross-examination. The first copy we read in the 1NC talks about how the process of optimization goes down. Gaps really fucked this up in the 2AR because it's an argumentation about because it's an argument that there is no health insurance, no healthcare without this desire for optimization and informatic health. This is a meta-uniqueness argument for how health insurance goes down and happens today, which should frame the rest of the debate. Currently, we only extract data from rich people, and with care in the United States, but the app expands access up to a whole arena of endo-colonialism, i.e. bringing people into our fold, like uninsured Latinos and Latinas across the world. Their linkages card talks about how the linkages they formulate create new lines of communication and dialogue to share tactics of resistance, but this is what our evidence frames as the desire for accumulating health in the project of the American civic exceptionalism under the guise of benign tutelage, which is an impact into how their cute little aspirational linkages go down. This seeks only to further cement the dichotomization of health and unhealthy to facilitate a global project and manifest destiny and interventions who just succeed. The presence of the U.S. Empire in American studies is also matched by the recognition of the state functionaries and also who debated, and also that delays the American Empire. Robert Scalia also invoking the kind of white man's word, and that is also that only continue explicit commitment to the evangelism of liberal democracy. One, the United States to maintain its own proper global role, but the paranoid empire also constructs an empire constituted by lack of enemy deficit, but the empire is also the exercise of sovereignty beyond territoriality. Successful hegemony based on delimited territoriality. Sovereignty is the basic time of territorial expansion, but the object of power is no longer humans, condemning, but post-humanist proliferation, continuity, intervention, and adjustment based on the empire is no longer based on the exercise of sovereign domination, but rather flexible capacity to intervene. Their continuing evidence is also the United States as a China puppet to the market of health, but also changing articulations of the empire can also become the apparently usual dominant of health in order to regenerate forms of expansion, but also give life to political in terms of domination and transfer after effective institutional strategies, and also reproductive disciplines of bodies, which means all of these arguments prove that they don't solve biopiracy, but only facilitate it. All of their defensive arguments are predicated on a misunderstanding of our argument, and the internal link being the civic creed in which they're kind of unified movements towards Trump kind of instantiate, which we have impact on and they don't have arguments against. Second is interest convergence. These people that are then expected to give thanks to America for healthcare and cooperate with Trump, thus normalizing him as a kind of another caring American sovereign, thus supporting a false Lincolnian promise of equality. It creates a city on the hill logic that is the basis for global humanitarian intervention. This is the kind of like multicultural politics, what solidifies the image of the U.S. as a global police, aka being able to tell Syria that they're defiling justice and then using our quasi-divine mandate to intervene in order to catch up with to cover up past issues like Iraq and rebuild America's power run in 15. fulfilling the creed of the entail of ending the discrimination is also emphasized the social mobility for black police in terms of the way that it is also inclusion for some arenas of power, but all about the invocation of creed to uphold the prerogatives of national security state, also commitment to the world community's ideals of protection of power, also means immense defense against the liberal the traditional civil rights discourse, also activists to combine a black integration with home and the Cold War commitment to politicians, also see the racial performance, preserving of American stability, and strengthening the moral standing globally, will also undermine the ability for Americans to appreciate the extent of their country from birth to enterprise and colonialism, market colonialism, which means it's one, not a link of omission, and two, the spillover arguments we have impact turn, but this new system based in biopiracy is a stealing of indigenous knowledge and rebranding it as our own. The movements that in cities and places draw informatic knowledge, i.e. how to improve health in the way it's based and health that is communicatively, informatically communicated and repurposed for U.S. improvement. They are basically the national genome development that creates inducements that destroy movements and facilitate biopiracy, which catalyzes dispossession and endless death.
Can you send us that solvent card you read?
The first card?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, was that not sent out?
Nope.
Sorry.
We're all holding until that happens?
Yep.
Well,
Yeah. Bad. It should be sent.
are y'all at again for time?
They are at
6:43.
Should treat this a little more carefully. K so then K.
How's it not working?
I don't know, it's just.
Where do we put the framework?
I'll just say framework. Good? Okay. Two ECF ballots versus single page laws to get that death gap that causes 65,000 deaths annually, results in chronic conditions and suffering, especially against women, trans folk. That is a form of violence that their theory has no way of explaining. Second, the afternoon's moves against neoliberalism through performative federations to single payer and academic spaces. This is often scam and form, not just content proofs. We have to evaluate the app first because we turn their arguments about and engaging metaphysical violence. We're reading specific critiques of their theory of violence. Lack of relationality is a product of neoliberalism, capitalism, unequal provision of social goods, sustains traditions, nobodiness with the death-making condition for disposability of black people, which means when they say sociality is a prerequisite, we're the only way to solve that. It's McCoy evidence, second is fetishization of self. Their fetish and their fungibility arguments focus on its defensive reaction to war fights, racializing gender reflex of capitalism, but never able to address its causes, broadest capital structures, resulting in lack of livable wages, worker rights, social service, and other social goods, and they disciplining of itself, an imperative that is a link to the information stuff at the top. We link to the data extraction. We don't take it from rich people right now, but from poor black people who can't afford treatment. That's the drop solvent evidence. They have to go to clinical trials in the status quo, which means that we link to this. But the fact that they've isolated this as an external reason of contingent violence that we're forced to confront means that the link to this is external offense, even when the theory is second. This their evidence is terrible. It's just about optimizing health. It's not good for the population being cared for. App is based on a social model of health. It's not connected to their impact argument. It goes health insurance, corporations extract information from other countries. Third is the app bans private and for-profit insurance and negotiates pharma into the ground. Means there's no reason to go abroad, but this means and this stuff is often threats or cement dichotomy of health argument. The Ahuja evidence about healthcare markets, which the app ends, which proves that this is net offense for us. It says the U.S. is an answer for being abroad to that is to secure capital's production of healthcare markets. The app and then nationalizes that industry, which means that there's no longer for-profit now. The interest conversions Trump stuff. The app solves A's non-reforms, reform, winning battles against the state, the strength of the health, bargaining for other benefits like community care centers. That's the day evidence. Second is movement building, reclaiming the academy, society, political struggle, using for mutual emancipation laws for organizing, strategizing, potential for fighting Trump. That's the Taylor evidence, which proves that it's on interest conversions because it's actively securing victories against Trump, which means that we're sufficient to solve the intervention in Syria, Libya, Iraq. Evidence is about healthcare markets. Again, the Aflaflian evidence is about anti-neoliberal movements and unions pushing for change at multilateral organizations like the WHO, which means we solve biopiracy globally. They don't solve their uniqueness argument because their alternative that calls for an end of the world doesn't change the material condition of biopiracy expanding abroad, which means that we're sufficient to solve the impact of this even if they win a marginal risk of a link. Okay. I'm going to start with the ontology stuff here because I think they were pretty light on justifying the theory, even if they asserted this to answer all of our individual pieces of offense. The McNay evidence answers their ontology arguments is based on a tautology and just means the circles on itself and definitely replicates the kind of metaphysical violence they're describing. Even if they win uniqueness arguments, they drop the Scott Samuelson evidence that it can get a whole hell of a lot worse, which means that the evidence key second is black consistent ontological extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. Started that with this debate at 0%, and it adjusts up. If we cast a little bit of doubt in your mind, you should refuse to be an executioner of hundreds of thousands of people. That was on case of liberal economy saying correct, it's not falsifiable. They just list a bunch of examples for how social systems harm black people. How do you know those aren't socialized injustices easily invertible, which proves that you can't know if you liberally invest, how much you liberally invest, or if you can liberally divest via the permutation. Second, psychological graphs only provide interpretive possibilities, not determinative, because identities are extremely complex. They can be knitted together through a plurality of different descriptions. They're malleable, shift over time, and exploit the cracks and fissures in different drives. That's Hoodis evidence. They can describe social and political phenomena. The phrase evidence says they flatten out over time and social systems because there are so many individuals within that system that it's different for each person. Second is empirical fallacy. Subconscious drives don't just arise out of nowhere. Nobody's racist because they're born. It's a learned behavior shaped by history. Insurance existed before slavery to control risk over property, which disproves an intrinsic link. Third is specificity. Movements for single payer examples of movement that build filters in civil society. They must beat the app to win the ontology debate. The app's a prerequisite. That's the Ansel evidence. Fourth is prior knowledge is impossible. The Gordon evidence took gas like 2 minutes into a degree. It's fantastic, and they just read a piece of Wilderson evidence from 2008, that is 9 years before this piece of evidence was written, and says that this is kind of based off of Gordon's understanding. There's a difference. Human actions create systems, not the other way around. Their theory would imply that the pre-human world was anti-black, and that's impossible. Today may be an anti-black world, but that does not mean the world is anti-black. Proven by their argument arguments about how politics can be good and that people are not de facto anti-black, like guerrilla warfare is somehow ethical under their interpretation, but not ours. They created perfectionism where any action doesn't completely resolve anti-blackness. It's a form of moral blackmail. That is a genocide against people who are suffering now. There's absolutely no way to verify the theory. They dropped empiricism and positivism is the threshold you should have for evaluating theories about the world. That's banned that a piece of evidence had gas right at the bottom, which proves that we have to default to race formation. They link just as much when Wilson interviews black revolutionaries. The fact they're able to reflect and theorize blackness is a performative contradiction with the relationality arguments. And second, it's falsifiability. But third, the alt fails because it misdescribes causality. Now, the affirmative debate, the model of debate where both teams clash over the interplay of arguments net better. Their role of the battle is judged entirely self-serving. It creates a shuts down the role for the other team. Means avoiding clash does not rebalance the scales. So justice moves too far in the other direction. They have the burden of rejoining to the plan is a bad idea. They have met the role of the negative. Sets the standard of social and epistemic perfection. Where if they point out one bad assumption, they win no matter what. They shuts down the quality of debating by overly privileging. Linked debating without alter impact explanation. It proves you can't look at the alternative in a vacuum. As our Neolib arguments proves, there are ways to grant energy to people that necessarily shutting down clash. Technical debates over single payer are good. One nuance to social health, no co-pays, deductibles, etc. Which means we solve nuanced discussion. Most people generally agree that the groundwork is laid for single payer. Presumption goes out globally because they have an alternative, and tide goes to the runner. It's about ending the world, solely trying to formulate meta ethics as moral pluralism that replicates the mass violence they describe. Planned Parenthood sterilization is not the F, which was done on the unionization stuff, on the case and the social health stuff, which is the data evidence, which is really undercovered in the block. The Sullivan evidence, they attack this as a cornucopia, but it's not about that. All the movement's arguments on case prove the F is politicizing is ethically dangerous, prevents privileged people from ever advocating for repressed groups. The hope is good for mental health. Wingate in 16. Consistent with the previous literature, hope is negatively correlated to depression. HTC was negatively correlated to suicidal ideation. When the controller persists with depression, high levels of the relation to suicidal ideation with no longer strong positive with low levels. Those who are more hopeful about buffered against deleterious effects and are better equipped to cope. This may protect against thoughts and suicide, marketed suicide permutation to both. The opposite prerequisite to sustain local engagement because it's impossible without social health proves they're the ones offering a false choice, starting with institutions that exclude the examinations of libidinal antagonism movements with that challenge capitalism, explicitly recognize your ability to link up with cross-identitarian and identitarian politics. That's a Taylor evidence, is not severance, because we still advocate the entirety of the app. They say and all their humanism stuff. It was impact turn, or and the piece, and they just assert that it relies on its opposite, but that there's zero proof and drop that we can reform humanism away from the binary. They formulated that evidence such as Nat Turner's rebellion in the U.S., the Haitian Revolution, Samuel Sharp's rebellion in Jamaica, and Tula's revolt in Curacao, which suspended the order of plantation for over a month, prove that it doesn't necessarily depend on its opposite. That's why it's radical. Now, however, starting with theorizing their forms of violence, resistance into something has to forfeit institutional challenge to state power, which means we solve the impact of the critique, but not vice versa, which means you have to default to us, and root cause isn't reverse cause, which means even if they're in the general explanation or theory, it's not unique offense for them because they have not one to link to how the app worsens it and the alt solves it.
643. Start back. gorgeous, okay? With an overview. Anyone not ready?
They have lost this debate at the level of ontology. We're winning that their entire field of knowledge is sutured by a value system that's only coherent through its expulsion of blackness from humanity. Cross-sex of the 2 and C was weird as shit because the questions already all missed the mark of this debate. Asking if black people should have healthcare may sound persuasive in other debates, but in this one it's largely incoherent. Saving black people from death only seems like a valuable task if we choose to forget the entire paradigm it operates on its premise of abandoning blackness to slaveness and stripping blackness to relationality and subjecthood in a manner similar to how building slave quarters with extended space on the plantation only seems valuable if we forget that it's built on a slave estate. The largest social determinant of health is the social world is divided by those who own and those who are owned. Democratic participation requires human autonomy and relationality as its constitutive conditions, which means civic engagement in the sociality that they engage is based on the sacrificial lamb of the slave, which is something the one has conceded. The nothingness of blackness against which human capacity is created is what makes it seem like saving people from pain is worthwhile, but also makes it impossible to understand how they can never plan to solve black suffering, because that suffering is born from an experience of vertigo that operates on the ontological register, not the sociological. We've impact turned their entire field of knowledge, which filters how you do impact the ontological register outweighs and comes first because it throws into disarray the metrics that they use to determine suffering and improvement. The measuring stick of impact calculus that they use is made from the wood of the lynching tree. The increments only make sense when we forget how that stick came to be there. Meaning making practice regards blackness be the 0 point of abjection. Unless the slave is of this world, we cannot approach gains and losses, which is claimed that they have not answered, which means that their impacts are largely incoherent in the face of the slave. To tell the slave she'll die without access to hospitals makes no sense in her state of vertigo, because her daily life is constituted by an ongoing deathliness cohered by the very paradigm of America. The K is a prerequisite to their impact claims because the way that they justify impacts is based on a value system that must not think through black suffering and vertigo. For them to be able to win this debate, they have to win that black relationality is possible and that the value system they cohere isn't relying on humanism, which is something they cannot win given the Tweezy's pivot to defend humanism. They close their only out of the ontology debate. The 1AR said something incoherent about lack of relationality as a product of the market, which is not substantiated by a card and theoretically makes nonsense. This you'll write RFDI go negative because given the asked value system is tainted by anti-blackness, I opt for the alternative transvaluation of pathology because in affirming nothingness in the void and avoiding social cost of blackness, I shall refuse to distance my ballot from the pathology of blackness because it ruptures the system of valuation. The affirmative forwards because that valuation risks distancing from the negative absence of blackness. Transvaluation is a revaluation of all values. Health itself is a move towards stable human corporeality. So occupying that space of abjection is the unlimited chaotic incoherence that's politically enabling and is called for insurrection in the ultimate end of this world. As we know, voting for black pathology means signaling, signing a neg val every time the 2AR says we save people from dying. The ontology debate, they say they send the McDaniel evidence that debates on tautology. The 1AR doesn't explain with it warrants. If we have to explain with warrants, they have to do that too. They say it can't get worse, not at the ontological level. They've read no evidence to substantiate. They've extend the Gordon evidence, but first is the 1AR was largely incoherent is extending warrants not even made by the card. They have no substantive answer to the Wilderson card that indicates Gordon's scheme of absence and presence is an elaboration of Fanon's argument for ontology, which echoes our claim that the world cannot accommodate black in relations at the level of subjectivity, which means black presence is a form of absence. In Gordon's words, to suggest Gordon thinks passing a plan to solve pain outweighs suffering and viewed in that system evaluation is a poor reading and is the reason why they've lost the ontology debate. Additionally, 2008 proves that this debate was settled back in 2008. They say liberal economy is social, but this is correct that they have conceded argument that they don't do anything to reshape that. They have conceded the argument that the 1AC doesn't do anything to reshape that, but rather exacerbates that through its move towards vitality. They say it's malleable, but it acts at the empirical level, not the ontological level. They haven't read cards that distinguish between the two. They say it's a quote, learned behavior shaped by history. They're correct that they don't change the constitutive elements of history, which is the invocation of humanism, which means that they don't solve the ontology debate. They say empiricism and positivism is good, but they conceded that it faces an entire register of anti-black violence, so their impact calculus misses the boat. That was the overview. They say the alternative fails, but it was politically enabling. I did that again on the overview at the top. The framework debate ontology means they don't get access to framework civic participation and duty relies on human relationality that cannot be afforded to the slave. The 3 this compromise example proves that plastic and elastic reshuffling as black subjects that are used only to extend the human relational capacity for their owners. The whole notion of fair, democratic, deliberative testing of impacts and consequences requires your ballot to endorse a model of ownership and human agency that's terminally fucked for the slave. Prefer our counterinterpretation to be a critical intellectual task with evaluating the best educational strategy. Consequences may matter, but if the paradigm of education is flawed, then you still default negative. This means you evaluate ontology before you evaluate framework, because ontology underlies values while framework contests values which matter. Winning the ontology debate means you don't even look to framework when arguing your RFD. The framework's arguments are premised off an egalitarian view that presents the slave and the human are on an equal playing field. Was the reason they don't get to weigh any of their framework claims because they're back on the ontology debate. They say that proving a part of your education is anti-black is enough for us to win this debate because it's violent towards blackness. That was the entire ontology debate. They say presumption goes affirmative. It actually goes negative because first, they haven't changed the structure or paradigm of America. Second of all, they don't create change under our value system, which is why it's largely incoherent. They extend the data evidence, but that's a link to framework because that requires civic participation, which requires notions of ownership that that we're impact turning. They say hope good is for mental health. The alternative isn't hope bad. The Warren argument says that we are a reconfiguration of hope in a way that looks towards the way that we can deconfigure the different bad parts of civil society. The permutation debate. The permutation is ridiculous. A move towards pathologies, a move away from healthiness and vitality. The permutation is still an investment in humanism because of its prioritization of healthiness as a form of social integration. It's a prime move towards plasticity like the three-fifths compromise, and that attempts to extend black humanity while also forgetting civil society is not elastic enough to accommodate a black relationality according to Wilderson. The permutation is figured through an investment in humanism without redefining it anyway away from slaveness, which means it still succumbs to all the link arguments. There's a poor choice between pathology and the one scene that anything that doesn't embrace the social cost of blackness to its full potential is something that we would reject, and the reason why your ballot also signals that poor choice. They say that movements can link up with your movements, assume relationality and capacity. Wilderson evidence we read indicates that black revolutionaries can't link up with those movements because of pathology. The permutation requires sanitizing the alternative. They say we can reform humanism. That's a joke. I answer that above. Also, the biopiracy is an external dissent to the alternative. You can vote on this even if we lose portions of the ontology debate. It isn't a contradiction. It operates on a different level as an external impact. Voting after this debate requires you to buy into a settler ruse of optimism that literally condemns millions of real material bonds at the everyday level, going along the way so the U.S. can rebrand itself as benign city on the hill. They have no impact defense. The road to solving their impacts is paved with the death of indigenous people in life worlds. The app is not worth it. We have turns to their death gaps argument. This means that arguments against interest convergence make no sense. The civil rights movement was too resistance against the government. They got appropriated. They aren't getting up to the linkages cause extraction argument. Their data evidence says the app is key to quote broadening the political base of coalitions. They have conceded that optimization is the
Modern will to help. The effect.
Right, 453.
Case than K. I'm good when everyone else is. Sweet. They've conceded a large external impact that only single payer can solve. Commodified healthcare puts medical access out of reach for millions, which results in a racialized death gap where insurance arbitrarily executes thousands of marginalized folk each year. Single payer is a tactical political response that can de-intensify violence and meaningfully improve the lives of not only black folk, but immigrants, trans folk who fall outside their limited white flag binary. That's our intel evidence. The 2NR is very weak at explaining how transvaluation can ever confront this violence. They don't even have an explanation for how that leads to broader movements to change civil society. They can't explain when healthcare would ever be ethical. That means that we win this debate within their framework, which was explained as having the best way to actualize movement. Theorization of the blackness solely on the train of ontology ignores the actual lived experience of black folk who have to choose between putting food on the table or paying their medical bills. The moral tunnel vision is a forced choice where any call for healthcare becomes diametrically opposed to prior theoretical questions. That's a bad model of politics and theory. Breaking down the racial and economic structures that perpetuate death gaps requires a response on the lived experience, not just the theoretical level. That's the Taylor, Gordon, McNay evidence. When can healthcare ever be ethical under their interp? Their answer is just, we just have to figure out this transvaluation thing. What values lead to good healthcare? They don't answer these. They just make some vague references to guerrilla warfare and never explain how they spill up to actual political practice. The ontological frame, even if it describes the present, there are still degrees of violence. There's a fundamental difference between dying from lack of healthcare and free insurance for all, which de-intensifies it. That's the Gordon evidence. The movement stuff, they didn't have any good answers to it. It catalyzes successful resistance to neoliberalism as a non-reformist form that serves as the engine of solidarity because the need for healthcare intersects across anti-racist, immigrant, feminist struggles. Neolib's a conceded existential threat. Massive resource extraction, climate change, antimicrobial resistance, spreading global inequality threaten the foundations for life on Earth, which is the McCoy evidence. We don't even need to win the perm because single payer is not an endpoint but a starting point, which can pave the way for more radical victories, which create fissures in civil society and actualize the transvaluation that they're talking about. That's the day evidence. They conceded that movements go global, affect the agenda setting of multilateral organizations, which hold global elites accountable. That's the Lawland evidence. They poorly extend this data turn at the bottom of the 2NR. It's offense for us because we ban private and for-profit insurance and negotiate farm into the ground, which means there's no reason to go abroad in order to collect data for biopiracy. They have forwarded this impact, which means it necessarily matters within their ontological frame, which is the reason why you can vote app. Now, the critique. I'm going to do all the ontology stuff here first because if we win it, it also takes out their framework argument because they stake the debate on it. You can't go for ontology when you drop all the analysis Salo does about psychoanalysis being wrong. This is the premise for every single argument they're going for because they're saying there's a libidinal investment in the anti-black order, and Wilderson's a Lacanian whose argument is that the symbolic order itself is anti-black. It's a bad analytic. It pathologizes oppression. Its ironclad determinism takes historically contingent practices and inscribes them as invariable features of the human condition, that inscribes these as inevitable, which blames the individual instead of the structure, that depoliticizes the movements. It means they can't result in change, and transvaluation is a bad analytic. It's a solipsistic term which brackets questions of practice, agency, and the subject in order to answer ethical a priori questions. That's the Hubis evidence. The theory is also wrong. Individuals are compositions of complex iterative possibilities. You can't assign one dominant structural paradigm to how people relate. Rather, humans are socialized to see the world a certain way. Therefore, counter-hegemonic movements such as the app can break the repetition and libidinally divest. B is that it's non-falsifiable. You can't test their theory. You can't apply individual psychology to systems which are constellations of conflicting drives. That's the Fraser evidence. Now, the radical humanism stuff here, it also answers the ontology debate. Their only answer was, quote, that's a joke. You can't reform humanism. That's not an argument. Our evidence says it can be strategically deployed. It's about It's about revolutionaries reclaiming it. It's talking about Cesar Senghor, who used humanist notions to critique Western imperialism and modernity. They can't explain racism bad without using humanist grammar of fairness or equality, which necessitates using all the tools we have to confront global challenges. It has an extinction impact, which has dropped nihilistic armed conflicts, global warming, etc. Proves that a problem-oriented approach to the affirmative is necessary, and ontological frames mean that you only ask ethical questions and never reconceptualize the world. It also answers their argument that blackness is a constant state of objection. It says it has the capacity for life. Lived experience characterizes it. Their plasticity argument on the permutation is our argument. Blackness retains the capability of living and its contingent manifestation. Now, all of the Gordon stuff here, they drop the feeling at feeling argument. The alt is a form of perfectionism that they say we should reject all future policy-making health-based because an imperfect solution could recreate anti-blackness. But they also argue that a rejection of anti-blackness is possible through transvaluation. That dooms their politics to perfectionism, where the only actions they take are the ones that completely eliminate anti-blackness from this world. Yet, failures and political actions in the past do change things. Maroon communities, the Haitian revolutionaries, Turner's Rebellion, all speaks to the necessity of being unequivocally without fear of failing. This is offense. Their pursuit of moralistic politics leads to literal genocide. What do you tell a poor black family who needs insurance? They would say you first have to determine the ethicality of the healthcare system before taking action, but that becomes a eugenic absolutism because they never identify this point at which we identify the values that should guide our decision making. This is supercharged by the drop McNay evidence in the blog. It says that ontological focus brackets off concerns about the ongoing lived oppression of reality, lived oppression of the reality. Their only answer to this Gordon evidence is that they read a card from 2008. Well, Gordon clearly disagrees, writing this fire card in 2017. Prior knowledge is impossible. Their theory says that the pre-human world is anti-black, which is clearly absurd. Today might be an anti-black world, but that does not mean the world is anti-black. It's also theoretical bad faith. The world is truly a closed system, then it would be impossible for someone to see its totality. That proves an outside must exist. History just proves contingency. All the movements, now framework. We get to obviously weigh the app, and if we don't weigh the app, we still win because all the ontology stuff impact turns it with radical humanism offense. But fairness is fundamentally unpredictable for the negative. Pick and choose the parts of the one you see they want to be evaluated. We do get to actualize the app. That was all the drop movement solvency stuff on case. Our Taylor evidence says that using academic spaces can chart political futures and challenge Trump fascism. If the left doesn't use debate, then the right wing will fill in and monopolize the policy agenda, which is net worse because they attack immigrants, continue the police assault against black and brown communities. They've also conceded that Trump's agenda is based on this calculation. The movements will oppose them, which means only we build a bulwark against them.
So the decision's in. It's a 3-0 for the affirmative from Emory.
I can speak. I voted that the app has external impacts that the K is not particularly well geared to answer. Neoliberalism leads to extinction, lots of suffering, death gaps kill lots of people, 65,000 a year, including immigrants and trans folks. I think much of the 2NR impact calculus is geared to answer an app that's just a link turn to the critique, which I'll admit is frighteningly common. But there are external impacts to the affirmative that have a lot of sway in my mind that the K is not geared to answer. On the ontology debate, I think the app is debating particularly well in two areas. The first is the section of the debate that libidinal drives are learned. I think your only response in the 2NR is that that's not what's taught by the affirmative. I think that this is true only in a very broad sense, in that in the context of the impacts the affirmative is trying to solve, they do teach something very different from the status quo libidinal drives in the way that they've empirically demonstrated as able to resolve death gaps. I think that there's a, particularly on the question of empirics, there's a troubling moment in cross-ex where they're asking what I think is normally a very silly question about falsifiability, and your response is that Wilderson does lots of research just like everyone else. And this line for me, in exact wording, disappears throughout the rest of the debate, but continues to be debated in this question of like, how are empirics different from anything else? And I think it's a silly question, because lots of things are not falsifiable, but we can know with them from extreme certainty through observation, and it would be disastrous to throw away those observations. But for the most part, you don't debate this question. You don't say, we know from observation that libidinal investments are real and extremely dangerous. You say, those observations are a problem to observe in the first place. And I think I'd be much more, I think it'd be much closer to voting negative if you just debated some of those, I think, very debatable empirical questions about observation. I think they win that they change, that empirics demonstrate that drives can change in particular areas. The particular areas of the affirmative have really big impacts. I think they also win that I can't just reject the question of empirics. I have to evaluate the case debate because it disproves some of the larger framing arguments if they win empirical examples of how things like the death gaps change. The alternative debate, I thought that the block set you all up well, but the 2NR has less depth than the block, and so little depth. Even the example of guerrilla politics disappears in the 2NR, and I just get the line that the alternative is politically enabling as kind of like this broad spillover claim that's not really spelled out. The affirmative has a very clear solvency deficit to this, that specificity is key in matters of healthcare policy, and if you don't get it right, it doesn't guarantee it'll fix the death gaps, and we empirically know that the F-specific solution will fix the death gaps. That's the core of my decision. I of course have other feedback things to say. I'll limit that to 3 things to let the other members of the panel talk. The first is that I think you need to get to case, and I think you need to, it's not just an accident, it's not even in the order. And that's particularly troubling given that the case debate includes a claim that neoliberalism is the root cause of anti-blackness and explains gratuitous anti-black violence. Now, that's a whiff because it's not in the 2AR, but it was in the 1AR, and I thought it would have been game over if they had extended that and you had got to it. That said, there's still big external impacts to the case that aren't explicitly debated from the critique. I think you can do a lot better job questioning the solvency of some of the ridiculous AF claims like the global movement spillover argument. There's a reason they wouldn't read this against the Northwesterns and MSUs of the world because it's a joke. But the solvency indicts are, in the 2NR, it's just black people can't engage with those movements. I can decide that's true and still think that those movements have the efficacy to address neoliberalism but not anti-blackness, which means there's still an impact to the affirmative without the second level debating of why the inclusion of those black movements are important. There's missed opportunities to just be like, look, all of Europe has single payer, and they have not solved neoliberalism. End of debate. That one-liner for me, probably, perhaps Emory has a hidden response to this about why the U.S. catching up to the rest of the world is key, but it's probably a joke, and that one-liner probably ends the movements debate for me. The
second big picture comment I have is the path of least resistance versus most resistance. I thought there were big 1AR weaknesses. I thought framework was undercovered relative to the ontology debate. I thought that the bottom of the 2NC, like independent voting issue wall, the Trump exceptionalism argument, the Auschwitz argument, the slavery as a metaphor argument, all of those things, well, not gigantic in the 2NC, are clearly labeled impact arguments that the 1AR undercovers relative to the ontology debate. I'm not necessarily saying this should have been the 2NR, but if you are not going to go for these arguments in this instance, when the 1AR clearly geared itself toward the ontology debate more than anything else, then I'm not sure they're worth making in the 2NC, because this would have been the time to go for it. My only other big picture comment was about doing more alt development in the 2NR, but I think I already said that, so I will yield to the rest of the panel for now.
So yeah, I largely went on the ontology debate. I agree with the kind of characterization of the way that we kind of learn desires. I think the way that I kind of get at this is you say, there's a moment in the debate where you're just like, yes, even if we live in, or even if the world itself is not anti-black, but our world right now is anti-black, you say the reason is because humanism exists and it creates a kind of horizon on our politics. The problem I have for that is I don't understand how this kind of answers their radical humanism arguments, and I think that I think that you can win my ballot pretty easily if you just characterize the way that you're going for this argument against their pivot of radical humanism and be a little bit more specific on that end. So in order to do that, a couple of things. First is I think that you just need to relate the arguments you're already making about humanism in the context of how the app describes their movements or whatever, right? So you can either say, on the one hand, develop your biopiracy arguments or develop your case arguments as examples for why their new version of humanism is just plain old humanism. And we don't need to win kind of every example of the app being bad, but even winning one of them is enough to kind of prove that comparing examples is problematic. The second thing is, and I'm inherently like an example-oriented judge, which I understand for your argument, you're like examples are bad because empirics, etc. But what I mean by that is, I think that the only thing you need to win for me is that what types of comparisons do they force us to make between what is acceptable violence or not acceptable violence, what value do you put in certain things. Once you kind of make those examples clear, and then you also say that there are ways that their movements kind of reinvest in humanism, then that's a reason why I shouldn't be making comparisons in the first place, and that's why I feel like even your new form of humanism, I shouldn't evaluate whether it's good or not good. The other way you can do this is I think you can just like counter the examples that they give for why new humanism is good. They are extremely vague on what their new vision of humanism is. The only thing they gave is a couple of examples about like Césaire and like the Haitian Revolution. You just need to pick one of these and be like, look, the Haitian Revolution was great, sure, they killed all white people and rewrote their constitution, but Dessalines still became emperor at the end of the day, right? That there are still vestiges of the way that constitutionalism or the way that liberal democracy works that will still overcode their movements. The next argument you can make to kind of win this for me is just, an extension of that is just like, you need to show the way that anti-blackness is trafficked into what their project is. And then finally, I just think that you need to, I think one moment where you can contextualize how comparing violence works for me or why that's problematic is on the permutation, right? So I think you need to make a bigger deal about all of the tiebreakers that they have on the permutation, why that is the link you're going for, and that even if they don't go for the permutation, the fact that they set that up is a reason why their new humanism or their new project still falls into that trap. I have some just like general comments, and then I have ways to develop the biopiracy stuff for y'all, but I can do that at the end. My general comment though, for everything is, one, you have to answer humanism process. They're like, what is humanity? If your whole pivot in the 2AC is like a new form of humanism, and there's no way out of that debate, you gotta answer it. For y'all, this Auschwitz analogy just sounds like you're making a recent analogy in process. I don't know why it's not one, and it seems like that could be a problem for y'all.
So I largely agree. I think that the block did set you up very well, and then it was just like several mistakes that were made in the 2NR that made it very difficult to vote neg, right? the first, I think, for me is this, like, well, not first, but a big problem for me was this alt explanation. Like, it's so shallow. I don't know what this, like, transvaluation of pathology looks like, or what the world looks like post-alternative, or when can we engage in, like, the question of, like, lack of access to healthcare, especially when you're not grappling with case at all, right? Like, you don't address any of their impacts. You don't answer, like, this the commodification of healthcare now means that people don't have access and people are dying because of it. You don't answer this, like, they solve for neolib because they move away from, like, neoliberal structures of healthcare. I think that's where a lot of the, like, main issues occur for me. But also, I just think there's a lack of explanation specificity that I normally see in all of your 2-Rs. Like, I've judged you a lot the last couple months, and, like, that was just not there this time. This, like, what you agree with them on their characterization of maybe we live in a world that is currently anti-Black, but that doesn't mean the world itself in the larger frame is anti-Black, but then not what that means in the context of your arguments, or why that means that they are just like regular humanism. They don't result in like some new, better form of humanism, right? Like you never get there. And this 2-R for me was very unusual based off what I've seen from him in the past, I guess. I agree. He needs to do more on like just like questioning of like this global spillover stuff. I think that is a mistake that happens on both sides, right? Like policy teams don't grapple with like critical apps. They just like go for framework and they don't grapple with like the very basic things that are like why they're problematic. And I think critical teams do the same thing on the negative, where they like don't grapple with the actual app itself and like the things within it that are illogical, right? And I think that is what makes teams successful, and when they can be more flexible about those arguments and responsive. Yeah, I don't want to like be repetitive, but I think all explanation, lack of specificity, not answering this sort of like why they aren't just this like normal, or not characterizing them as just like this regular old humanism. Also, the ontology debate in the seminar I felt like was really weak and just not what I'm used to seeing, I guess, from you. Yeah, I can answer specific questions, but that's what my thought came down to.
That makes sense. If I have questions, I'll probably end up shooting out emails.
So,
That's cool.
Yeah, the last stuff I wanted to say at the end. So I think the way you can go for these case arguments in a pretty persuasive way in the 2-R is to, one, leverage the kind of sequencing arguments you're using on framework as a reason why all of their 1-AR arguments are basically just like, we magically have movements and they solve all of these things. That positing and the vagueness of that is the promise of humanism that you're saying is problematic. And so the kind of sequence of how their politics gets enacted means that you can't grant them all these magic things we're talking about. The second thing you can do is I think you should just make arguments about the way that corporations will seek profits elsewhere to begin with, which means that it ramps up the clinical trials that you're talking about. They're like clinical trials happen now, that's the status quo. Yeah, but all the ones that domestically happen in the US still happen in other countries now. That's the same thing that happened like when ACT UP pushed for a bunch of clinical trials in the US over kind of HIV/AIDS stuff, that the way that corporations fast-tracked that was to do all of that outside the US, right? That would replicate when passing the app. And the fact that you don't need to win that like that offshoring outweighs their app. You just need to win that like that type of violence should not be calculated to begin, right? That marginal exporting of clinical trials shouldn't be calculated. Another argument you make is just about land grabs, right? So you have this biopiracy argument. I think you can develop that a lot and just be like, look, even if all this clinical trial stuff happens, there's still a question of like, where do we produce medicine? How we like farm the Amazon and all of that stuff for producing medicine, and that creates conflicts within politics that they haven't explained how you resolve, right? They're just like, well, everyone kind of gets on board and does this transnational thing, but what happens when certain communities who have a connection to their land get in conflict over other communities that need health care? That's not something that they can explain or have gotten anywhere to the level of explaining, and so that's at least an example of why the app can't solve or stuff like that.
Just on the last thing, why does the kind of land grabbing versus people in the U.S. who want healthcare stuff, or how do you envision that plugging into the impact calculus stuff that 2NR needs to go for to win this like humanism ontology stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think that the argument you can make is that the fact that those comparisons have to exist in their vision of politics, or they haven't explained a way out of those comparisons, means that their decision making will always kind of fall into the trap of who deserves freedom or doesn't deserve freedom.
Oh, yeah. Okay.
Right? Who deserves or doesn't deserve violence.
Yeah.
And that's how they kind of shift the borders of what's acceptable or not acceptable. Other things you can do is I think have more examples of just like the Planned Parenthood, Viva Provera stuff. So I think you should have examples of the way that kind of the process of activism happens. The example I've been telling teams to kind of say is during ACT UP New York, there was a protest that they planned to get rid of some incoming New York official, and the official was black. And so the protest they had was to burn effigies of this official to kind of reject it. And in the process of that protest, there were a lot of black members in ACT UP who were like, hey, this is functionally simulating a lynching, we like probably shouldn't do that. But the anarchic democratic system of ACT UP meant they did the protest anyway. Right, so those examples of anti-blackness in the process of movement building makes it a lot harder for them to explain why that won't happen.
I just have 2 comments for you all if you're interested. Before I say those, I do want to say this is an incredibly enjoyable debate to judge, and my usual 2 key metrics for that you all excelled at. I keep a list during the debate that I process during prep time of what I would call must-answer arguments. That list was very long after the block, and to me that's a sign of a very good and enjoyable debate to judge. And also the very specific DAs on case made me appreciate this debate as well. 2 comments though. Niche, right?
Yeah.
Cross-X of the 1AC. You're all bait and no switch. My advice for you would be argue, don't ask. My chief example of this, although I think this is sort of how all your questions are structured, you get to the bottom and you ask this question, how is Trump different? And it's a setup for the Trump exceptionalism, okay? But they link already. They've made the argument. It's quite clear. And you do get them to give 3 specific examples, the ACA, the wall, and Bolton. But don't just get the link you already have. Start proving your argument that their examples are wrong. Because in my mind, after this cross-X, they've made 3 arguments about why your critique of Trump exceptionalism is wrong. They've got 3 warrants. You've just sort of hinted at or implied or set up a link for a future argument when you could be pushing back against all of these warrants and starting to get airtime for your argument. They're not particularly good arguments. Bolton was literally a Bush administration official. We don't like him because he is responsible in part for the war in Iraq, which is literally demonstrative of the past not being different from Trump. We literally don't like Bolton because he did bad things in the Bush administration. The wall, there's plenty of examples about detention being a longstanding policy. All these things can be pushed back against, but you let them start the debate very early and get marks on the board, warrants, arguments, and you're not pushing back. And I think throughout this process, it shouldn't just be, will you say you're humanist? Will you say Trump is different? Start the debate about whether or not those things are good or bad. It can't hurt you to have more warrants out early in the debate, to have me thinking about and evaluating the truth value of your argument earlier in the debate. Rahul, 1R stuff, just one comment. The framework text in the 1R, I think I get what you want, but the wording confuses me. I think it's they get the politics but not the plan. I don't know why they wouldn't be okay with that. They even use the explicit phrase to answer framework. If we win the ontology debate, it answers framework because it proves our politics is a good idea. It doesn't seem like the politics is different enough for the plan for them to make a very easy, we win in your framework argument because everything we've said is a defense of our politics. And the plan is just one more micro example of a defense of why we think single payer and anti-neoliberalism movements are good. So I would have because that key line is so important, it's what we use to evaluate all of the framework debate. I would have that line be a little bit more careful and exclusive of the affirmative. So I don't think it's worth it to do the framework impact debate if you're not winning the argument that I shouldn't evaluate the consequences of the affirmative, which doesn't seem to be what the phrasing of your interpretation is.
So what do you envision to be one in these like resistance-y type, like, oh,
I'm not even sure you need an interpretation. If you win the pornotroping argument that evaluating the consequences of the plan has negative repercussions in the real world, and obviously doing the plan never happens, then you've won an argument to not evaluate the plan. You don't have to use that explicit phrase, you don't have to have an inter, but you can read a critique of simulating the consequences of the plan where the impact is don't do it. Or you could just have the explicit sentence be don't evaluate the consequences of the plan. It's simple, it makes the app go away, which is like awesome strategically. You just have to win the impact of it. Either way, the end game is the same. You have to win a disad to evaluating consequences that outweighs fairness, etc. But I'd say go for the big prize. Otherwise, it's not worth it to spend time there. The big prize is don't evaluate the app.
Mhm.
Pornotroping is a good reason.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah.
I was gonna.
Oh, okay.
You don't have any other
Yeah,
questions?
I think that makes sense from that.
Couple quick comments for you all. Like I said, there's this, what I thought was a great moment for you in CrossX, or at least the best possible outcome of asking the falsifiability question, where they're like, Wilderson does research like everyone else. You got there, make something of it. 1AR, I thought what I just said to them about framework, you could be better on explicitly saying we win in your interpretation in the 1AR. You could be better on what both Taylor and I have said, which is like the alternative is kind of wishy-washy, new possibilities, politically engaging. What does that mean? You like say guerrilla tactics is, you like imply guerrilla tactics are unethical. There's no like 1AR guerrilla tactics doesn't solve the F. Guerrilla tactics, it's like they get crushed by the state. It's like the state's doing fine. Empirically, like not great. Push back on the just like jump off a cliff, see what happens. Alternative can be powerful, but doesn't have a lot of specificity. Push back on that more. Otherwise, the 1AR is fantastic. 2AR hints at this, but the neoliberalism stuff in the 1AR, it's like you functionally read the CAPK against them, but they don't get the permutation. It's like how I was thinking about how this was debated after the 1AR. I thought that was pretty tricksy, but then it's just like not in the 2AR. Last comment, ontology debate. I thought you would have been better off picking a few winners and developing them more. Empiric's good, empirical knowledge about the app from Latin America, the VA, sitting on that more, sitting on libidinal Dresser learned more, and just maybe just going for those two arguments, but with more development. Because I have a lot of things flowed from you all in the ontology debate that aren't those things, that just aren't doing a lot of work for you.
I agree. I think that's like the ontology debate was a mistake that kind of occurred in both the 2NR and the 2AR, where the 2NR was like 1AR didn't really touch on it, and then the 2AR like no, they didn't touch on it, and then it was very flippant. It didn't just sit on like the empiric's good argument or the null drives argument, especially after the 2NR where they're like, we agree with this whole like it's anti-black now. We can the world itself might not be. I think that makes that argument even easier in the 2AR to go for.
Good debate.
Thanks, thank you. Thank you.